Some things stay with you longer than they should, like the weight of a wedding ring sliding from one finger to another in the dark. My name is Director Chen, and I've been running Willowbrook Cemetery for nearly 2 decades. In that time, I've overseen thousands of burials, hundreds of exhumations, and more grief than any one person should witness in a lifetime. The work has its rhythms, the careful preparation, the respectful handling of remains, the quiet dignity we maintain even when no family members are watching. But sometimes, the dead don't follow the same rules we do. Mrs. Eleanor Holloway was buried on a Tuesday morning in March. I remember, because it was unusually warm for the season, and the ground was soft enough that our crew didn't need the hydraulic equipment. She'd been married to Harold for 63 years, and when he spoke at the service, his voice carried the weight of a man who'd lost half of himself. She wore her wedding dress from 1957, yellowed with age but still elegant, and that simple gold band she'd never removed, not even for surgery 10 years prior. The exhumation order came 3 months later. The family had purchased a plot in the newer section, closer to where Harold would eventually rest. These relocations aren't uncommon, though they're never easy. There's something unsettling about disturbing a grave, even for the best reasons. The paperwork was in order, the permits signed, and Harold himself had requested the move. We scheduled it for early morning, before the heat became unbearable. My crew and I arrived at sunrise, bringing the portable lift and fresh flowers for the reburial. Plot 47B was in the older section beneath a oak tree that had probably been there since before the cemetery existed. The headstone was simple granite, just her name and dates, with beloved wife carved beneath. The excavation went smoothly. Mrs. Holloway's casket was a quality piece solid oak, with brass fittings that had held up well underground. When we lifted it, I noticed the weight felt right, substantial but manageable. We transported it carefully to the preparation area, where Harold waited with his daughter, Margaret. It's standard procedure to open the casket for family identification before reburial, even when only a few months have passed. I've done this countless times, always with the same gentle efficiency, always with the same respectful distance. But when I lifted the upper portion of Eleanor Holloway's casket, something made me pause. Her hands were folded across her chest, just as we'd positioned them in March. The burial dress remained pristine, her gray hair still carefully arranged. But something was different about her left hand. It looked somehow empty, though I couldn't immediately place why. Then, I saw it. The wedding ring that Harold had refused to remove from her finger, the ring that had been such a struggle to leave in place during preparation, was now on her right hand, not loose or shifted, but properly positioned on her ring finger as if someone had carefully moved it there. I stared for a long moment, my mind trying to process what I was seeing. In 20 years of funeral work, I'd seen decomposition, I'd seen settling, I'd seen the natural changes that time brings to the dead. But I'd never seen jewelry migrate from one hand to another. Margaret noticed my hesitation. "Is everything all right, Director Chen?" I managed to maintain my professional composure, though my heart was beating faster than it should have been. "Everything appears to be in order. Would you like a moment with your mother?" Harold stepped forward, his cane tapping against the concrete floor. His eyes went immediately to Eleanor's face, then down to her hands. For several seconds, he didn't speak. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "She's wearing her ring on the wrong hand." Margaret frowned. "What do you mean, Dad?" "The ring," Harold repeated, pointing with a trembling finger. "She always wore it on her left hand. 63 years. Never took it off. Always left hand." He looked up at me, confusion, and something else, maybe fear, clouding his eyes. "Why is it on her right hand now?" I had no answer. In my experience, bodies don't rearrange their own jewelry. Rings don't migrate between fingers, especially not rings that fit snugly enough to require soap removal during preparation. I'd personally ensured that Eleanor's ring stayed in place, respecting Harold's wishes even though it complicated the embalming process. "Sometimes shifting occurs," I heard myself saying, though the words felt hollow even as I spoke them. The ground movement, temperature changes. But even as I offered these explanations, I knew they didn't make sense. Rings don't jump from finger to finger because of ground settlement. Harold stepped closer to the casket, his weathered hand hovering over Eleanor's. She was left-handed her whole life, he said softly. Wrote with her left hand, ate with her left hand, wore her ring on her left hand, but when she slept, he trailed off, his eyes distant with memory. When she slept, what, Dad? Margaret prompted gently. Harold's voice was so quiet, I had to lean forward to hear him. When she slept, she always moved her ring to her right hand. Said it was more comfortable that way, less likely to catch on the sheets. 63 years of marriage, and every single night, she'd move that ring from her left hand to her right before she went to sleep. The preparation room fell silent, except for the hum of the ventilation system. I found myself looking down at Eleanor's face, peaceful and serene, exactly as we'd left her 3 months ago. But now, wearing her ring the way she had every night for 63 years of marriage, she looked less like someone who had died, and more like someone who was simply sleeping. We completed the reburial without further incident. The service was brief. The casket lowered into its new resting place with the same dignity we'd shown the first time. Harold thanked me, shook my hand, and walked away leaning heavily on Margaret's arm. That was 6 months ago. Since then, I've conducted dozens of services, overseen countless preparations, and maintained the same professional standards that have defined my career. But every morning when I put on my wedding ring, I pause for just a moment, making sure it's on the correct hand. And sometimes, late at night when I'm settling into bed, I catch myself looking at it again, wondering if some habits run deeper than death itself. I still think about Eleanor Holloway, sleeping peacefully in Plot 47B, wearing her ring exactly the way she preferred. Some might call it impossible. But after 20 years in this business, I've learned that the impossible is just another word for things we don't yet understand. The dead don't usually wear makeup better than they did in life, but sometimes they get help from unexpected places. My name is Rosa Martinez, and I've been preparing bodies for viewing for 15 years. It's delicate work, restoring dignity, creating peace, giving families one last beautiful memory of their loved ones. Every detail matters. The angle of the hands, the set of the mouth, the color that brings warmth back to cold skin. I take pride in my work, in the way I can make death look like gentle sleep. Mrs. Catherine Wells came to us on a Thursday evening in October. 78 years old, passed quietly in her sleep after a brief illness. Her daughter, Linda, was devastated but practical. She wanted a closed casket service. Just family, nothing elaborate. Catherine had been a teacher for 40 years, never married, devoted her life to her students and her books. Linda was her only child, born late in Catherine's life, when she was already in her 40s. The exhumation request came 6 weeks later. Legal complications with the cemetery plot, a mix-up with the deed that required temporary relocation, while lawyers sorted through decades-old paperwork. These things happen more often than people realize, and while they're unpleasant, they're part of the business. I wasn't scheduled to work that night, but the family specifically requested me. Linda remembered how peaceful her mother had looked during the viewing, how I'd managed to capture something of the woman she'd been in life. "You made her beautiful," she'd said at the time, tears streaming down her face. She would have liked that. The midnight exhumation was routine until we opened the casket for identification. I'd prepared Catherine Wells myself, so I knew exactly what to expect. The simple gray dress Linda had chosen, the minimal makeup I'd applied, the careful arrangement of her silver hair. But when I lifted the upper portion of the casket, something was immediately different. Catherine's lips were painted with lipstick, not the subtle, natural tone I'd used during preparation, something I'd chosen to complement her pale complexion and age. This was different, deeper, richer. a burgundy shade that seemed to catch the fluorescent lights of the preparation room and throw them back in a way that made her mouth look almost alive. I stared for a long moment, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. In 15 years of embalming work, I'd never seen cosmetics change after burial. Lipstick doesn't migrate. It doesn't deepen or shift colors. It certainly doesn't appear where none existed before. "Is everything all right?" asked Detective Morrison, who was overseeing the exhumation for legal purposes. "Standard procedure when there are property disputes." "Yes," I managed, though my voice sounded strained even to my own ears. "Just conducting the identification." But it wasn't just the lipstick. As I looked more closely, I realized the shade was familiar. I'd seen it before, recently, but not on Catherine Wells. It was the exact color Linda had been wearing at the funeral, a vintage burgundy that had struck me as unusual for a woman in her 30s. Most people choose subdued tones for funerals, but Linda had worn that bold color like armor, like a way of honoring her mother's memory. The problem was, Linda had been dead for 2 years. I'd prepared Linda Wells myself, back in 2021. Car accident on the interstate. Sudden and terrible. Catherine had been inconsolable, her only child, gone at 35, leaving her utterly alone in the world. The funeral had been devastating. Catherine weeping over her daughter's casket, wearing the same burgundy lipstick that was now somehow on her own lips. But that was impossible. Catherine Wells had died 6 weeks ago, 2 years after her daughter. I'd prepared her myself, and I remembered every detail. The minimal makeup, the peaceful expression, the way Linda had thanked me for making her mother look like herself again after the illness had taken so much. I closed the casket quickly, my hands shaking slightly as I secured the latches. "Identification confirmed," I told Detective Morrison. "Catherine Wells, as expected." The reburial proceeded without incident, but I couldn't shake the image of that lipstick, so perfectly applied, so vibrant against her pale skin. Back at the funeral home, I pulled Catherine's file, checking my own preparation notes. Everything was documented exactly as I remembered. Minimal cosmetics, natural tones, simple presentation per family request. I also pulled Linda's file from 2 years earlier. There, in the personal effects inventory, was a note I'd made at the time. Burgundy lipstick, Revlon wine with everything, to be buried with deceased per mother's request. Catherine had insisted that Linda be buried with her favorite lipstick, the one she'd been wearing the day she died. The security footage from the cemetery showed nothing unusual. No visitors during the 6 weeks Catherine had been buried. No disturbances to the gravesite. The cameras had been installed after a series of vandalism incidents the previous year, and they covered every angle of the cemetery grounds. If someone had visited Catherine's grave, there would be a record. But as I sat in my office that night, reviewing the footage for the 3rd time, something caught my attention. In the corner of one frame, dated just a week after Catherine's burial, there was a figure near her grave. The timestamp showed 2:17 in the morning, and the image was blurry, just a shadow, really, barely visible even when I enhanced it. The figure appeared to be kneeling beside the headstone, but the resolution was too poor to make out any details. It could have been a person, or a trick of light, or simply the way shadows fell across the monuments at that hour. But there was something about the shape, the way it seemed to lean forward, that made me think of someone applying makeup with great care and attention. I printed the frame and studied it under my desk lamp, trying to make out more details. The figure was small, delicate, definitely female, if it was human at all. And there, barely visible in the grainy image, was what might have been long hair, the way Linda used to wear hers. But Linda Wells was buried 3 miles away, in Riverside Cemetery, where her young life had ended too soon. I'd personally delivered her body there 2 years ago, watched as the earth closed over her casket, seen the finality of death in her mother's broken expression. The next morning, I called Riverside Cemetery to inquire about their security measures, claiming routine professional curiosity. The groundskeeper mentioned that they'd had some unusual incidents recently. Flowers appearing on graves where families hadn't visited, personal items being rearranged, a few reports of a young woman seen wandering the grounds at night. Strange thing is, he said, she's always perfectly dressed, like she's going somewhere special. Someone reported seeing her wearing this beautiful burgundy lipstick, said it was too bold for a cemetery visit, but somehow it looked just right on her. I thanked him and hung up, my hands trembling slightly as I set down the phone. That afternoon, I drove to Riverside Cemetery and found Linda Wells' grave. The headstone was clean, the grass neatly maintained, but something felt different, wrong, as if the grave had been disturbed recently, though there were no visible signs of digging. Near the base of the headstone, almost hidden in the grass, I found something that made my breath catch in my throat. A small gold tube of Revlon lipstick, wine with everything, barely used. The same shade I documented in Linda's personal effects 2 years earlier. The same shade that had somehow appeared on her mother's lips 6 weeks after burial. I never reported what I found. How do you explain that the dead might visit each other? That a daughter's love could somehow reach across the divide between cemeteries, between worlds? Instead, I kept the lipstick tube in my desk drawer, where it sits today, a reminder that some bonds are stronger than death, and some daughters will always take care of their mothers no matter where they rest. Some problems fix themselves, and those are the ones that keep you awake at night. My name is Dale Thompson, and I've been maintaining cemetery grounds for 22 years. Most folks think groundskeeping is just mowing grass and trimming hedges, but there's more to it than that. You learn to read the land, to notice when things are out of place, when the earth itself seems restless. And sometimes, you learn that not everything that moves underground is supposed to be there. The headstone in row 9 started shifting in November. Nothing dramatic at first, just a slight eastward lean that made the monument look askew when you approached from the main path. Mrs. Helena Vasquez, buried 3 years prior, age 84, survived by 2 sons and a daughter, who visited every Sunday with fresh carnations. I noticed it during my morning rounds, the way the stone tilted just enough to catch shadows differently. Cemetery headstones are built to last. Solid granite, set in concrete foundations that can withstand decades of weather and ground movement. But sometimes settling occurs, especially after heavy rains or freeze-thaw cycles. It's part of the job, keeping things level and dignified. The first repair was straightforward. I used the hydraulic lift to raise the stone, checked the foundation, added fresh concrete where needed. The monument went back to perfect vertical, exactly as it should be. I made a note in my daily log. Row 9, Vasquez Monument. Minor settling corrected. Routine maintenance. Nothing more. 3 days later, the stone had shifted again. Same eastward lean, same 3-inch displacement, as if my repair work had never happened. The concrete I'd poured was still wet, still curing, but somehow the monument had moved despite being properly secured. I fixed it again, this time with extra reinforcement. Steel brackets, deeper foundation work, enough concrete to hold a monument twice the size. The kind of foundation that should last another 50 years without any movement at all. But 4 days later, the stone had shifted eastward again, exactly 3 inches, as if some invisible force was deliberately moving it during the night. That's when I started paying closer attention to the details around Helena Vasquez's grave. The grass grew differently there, thicker, greener, even in winter when the rest of the cemetery was dormant. The soil had a different texture, darker and richer than the surrounding earth. And there were small disturbances in the ground that I hadn't noticed before. Tiny fissures that seemed to radiate outward from the grave itself. The family noticed too. Rosa Vasquez, Helena's daughter, mentioned it during one of her Sunday visits. "Something's not right with Mama's stone," she said, her voice carrying the concern of someone who'd been visiting the same grave for 3 years. "It keeps leaning, like she's trying to see something to the east. I assured her the ground settling was normal, that we'd take care of it permanently. But privately, I was starting to wonder what lay 3 rows east of Helena Vasquez's grave. I checked the cemetery records, cross-referencing plot numbers and burial dates, looking for some connection that might explain the persistent movement. 3 rows east, in the exact direction the stone kept leaning, was the grave of Marcus Chen, age 37, buried the same week as Helena in 2020. No family connection that I could find, no obvious reason why one grave would somehow be oriented toward another. But the alignment was perfect. If Helena Vasquez's headstone could see, it would be looking directly at Marcus Chen's final resting place. I decided to excavate. Working alone before dawn, I used the small excavator to carefully expose the upper portion of Helena's casket. Standard procedure when there's concern about structural integrity or ground instability. But what I found made me question everything I thought I knew about burial practices. The casket itself was undisturbed, properly positioned, and sealed exactly as it had been during the burial 3 years earlier. But there were marks on the interior of the concrete vault, scratch marks that appeared to come from inside, as if something had been trying to claw its way out. The marks were precise, deliberate, concentrated on the eastern wall of the vault. More disturbing were the scratches I found on the inside of the casket lid when I opened it for inspection. Deep gouges in the satin lining, patterns that looked almost like fingernails dragging across fabric. But Helena Vasquez's hands were exactly as they'd been positioned during burial, folded peacefully across her chest, her nails perfectly manicured, showing no signs of damage or struggle. Her face was turned slightly toward the east wall of the casket, though I knew for certain she'd been positioned facing upward during the burial. It was a small change, almost natural looking, as if she'd simply turned her head to look at something interesting. But the dead don't turn their heads, and they don't scratch at casket linings with fingernails that show no wear. I closed everything up and restored the gravesite, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd missed something important. That night, I positioned a motion-activated camera near Helena's grave, hidden among the decorative bushes that bordered row 9. If the headstone was moving on its own, I wanted documentation. If someone was visiting the grave after hours, I needed to know who. The footage I retrieved the next morning showed nothing but empty cemetery grounds, shadows moving with the wind, the occasional rabbit or raccoon crossing between headstones. But at exactly 3:17 in the morning, the camera recorded something that made my hands shake as I watched it back. The headstone moved, not dramatically, not with any visible external force, but with a slow, steady shift that took nearly 10 minutes to complete. 3 inches eastward, exactly as it had moved every other time. But there was no wind strong enough to cause such movement, no seismic activity, no mechanical explanation for what I was seeing. More unsettling was what happened at the moment the movement began. The camera's audio picked up a sound that was barely audible, a soft scratching like fingernails on wood that seemed to come from underground. The sound lasted for the entire 10 minutes it took the stone to shift, then stopped abruptly when the movement ended. I played the recording for my supervisor, showing him the clear documentation of the headstone's inexplicable movement. But when we returned to the gravesite that afternoon, the stone was perfectly vertical again. No lean, no displacement, positioned exactly as it should be, with no sign that it had ever moved at all. Probably just equipment malfunction, my supervisor said, checking his watch. These old cameras pick up all kinds of interference. I'll request a new foundation pour if you think it's necessary, but the stone looks fine to me. I nodded and agreed, but I knew what I'd seen. That night, I set up the camera again, this time with backup batteries and a second angle for verification. At 3:17 in the morning, the same thing happened, the slow, deliberate, eastward shift, accompanied by that soft, scratching sound that seemed to come from 6 feet underground. But this time, I was watching from my truck parked near the cemetery gates. I saw the movement happen in real time, saw the massive granite monument shift position with no visible cause, as if guided by some invisible hand. And in the silence that followed, I heard something that made me question my own sanity. A woman's voice, soft and distant, speaking words in Spanish that I couldn't understand, but somehow knew were important. The next morning, I visited Rosa Vasquez at her home, bringing the camera footage with me. She watched in silence as her mother's headstone moved on its own, her face growing pale as the audio picked up that familiar scratching sound. "What is she saying?" I asked about the voice at the end of the recording. Rosa closed her eyes, listening to the faint Spanish words with an expression that mixed sorrow and understanding. When she opened her eyes, tears were streaming down her face. "She's saying, 'I'm coming, mi amor,'" Rosa whispered. "She used to say that to my father every night when he worked late shifts. 'I'm coming, my love. Wait for me.'" I looked back at the footage, at the headstone that had moved 3 inches closer to Marcus Chen's grave, and suddenly understood. Helena Vasquez hadn't been trying to escape her burial. She'd been trying to reach someone who was waiting for her, someone whose grave lay exactly 3 rows east of her own resting place. Later that day, I checked Marcus Chen's burial records more carefully. 37 years old, survived by his wife, Helena, who had died 1 week later of what the death certificate listed as natural causes. But what Rosa later explained was a broken heart. Helena Vasquez had been Helena Chen before she remarried in her 70s. Marcus had been her first husband, her great love, separated from her by 40 years and 3 rows of cemetery ground. And somehow, even in death, she was still trying to reach him, still calling out those familiar words of comfort and devotion. I never moved the headstone again. Every few months, it shifts eastward, and every few months, it returns to its original position, as if the journey itself is more important than the destination. The scratching sounds continue, but now I understand them differently, not as attempts to escape, but as the sound of love that refuses to be contained by wood and earth and time. Rosa visits every Sunday, bringing fresh carnations and speaking to her mother in Spanish. Sometimes, if you listen carefully, you can hear an answer carried on the wind, faint but unmistakable. "I'm coming, mi amor. Wait for me." The living and the dead both have their visiting hours, but sometimes they don't align the way they should. My name is Chaplain Morris, and I've been providing spiritual comfort at Westfield Cemetery for 18 years. Most of my work happens during daylight hours memorial services, grief counseling, the quiet conversations that help families process loss. But the cemetery operates around the clock, and sometimes the most meaningful encounters happen when the world is sleeping. I started noticing her during my first year on the job. Every Tuesday at 3:17 in the morning, the same elderly woman would appear at the cemetery gates, asking about her boy Tommy. She was always dressed in a navy blue coat that looked like it belonged to the 1950s, with her gray hair pinned back in a style that had gone out of fashion decades ago. Her voice carried the accent of someone who'd learned English as a second language, possibly German or Polish. "Excuse me," she would say, her voice trembling with age and anxiety. "I'm looking for my boy Tommy. Do you know where they put my Tommy?" The first few times it happened, I tried to help her search our records. Tommy was a common enough name, and we had several Thomas entries in the cemetery database spanning multiple decades. But every name I suggested was met with the same confused shake of her head. No, that's not my Tommy. My Tommy is just a boy, 7 years old. They said they brought him here, but I can't find him anywhere." I would walk with her through the cemetery grounds, checking children's sections and family plots, looking for any grave that might belong to a 7-year-old Tommy. But we never found what she was looking for, and after an hour of searching, she would simply fade back into the darkness, apologizing for the trouble and promising to return the following week. This went on for months. Every Tuesday at 3:17, without fail, the same woman appeared with the same desperate question about the same missing child. I started arriving early on Tuesday nights, bringing coffee and a flashlight, prepared to help her search once again through headstones and monuments for a boy who seemed to exist only in her memory. It wasn't until my second year that I thought to check the cemetery's older records, the handwritten logs that dated back to the cemetery's founding in 1922. Buried in the archives, written in fading ink on yellowed paper, I found something that made my blood run cold. Thomas Mueller, age 7, buried April 15, 1938. Survived by his mother, Anna Mueller, age 42. Cause of death, pneumonia. But there was no current grave marker for Thomas Mueller, no plot number that corresponded to existing records, no headstone bearing his name. According to the burial log, Thomas had been interred in Section C, plot number 112. But when I visited that location during daylight hours, I found only an unmarked patch of grass with no indication that anyone had ever been buried there. The surrounding graves were clearly marked and well maintained, but plot 112 appeared to be empty ground. I researched further, diving deeper into the cemetery's history. In 1954, Section C had been partially relocated to make room for a new drainage system. Families were notified, remains were carefully moved to new plots, and headstones were transferred to their new locations. But some graves, the ones with no surviving family members, no one to claim them or oversee their relocation, were simply left behind. Thomas Mueller's grave had been one of those forgotten in the relocation process. His mother, Anna, had died in 1953, just 1 year before the relocation began. With no surviving relatives to advocate for him, 7-year-old Tommy had been abandoned beneath what was now an empty section of lawn, his headstone removed and discarded, his memory erased from the official records. But his mother hadn't forgotten. I found Anna Mueller's death certificate in the county records. April 12, 1953. Natural causes. Buried in Westfield Cemetery, Section C, plot 114. Just 2 plots away from her son. Close enough that she could have visited his grave every day for the 15 years between his death and hers. The revelation should have provided closure, but it only deepened the mystery. Anna Mueller was buried in Section C, in a marked grave with a proper headstone that I could visit during daylight hours. So who was the woman who appeared every Tuesday night, searching for her lost boy with the desperate devotion of a mother who would never stop looking? I decided to spend a full night at Anna Mueller's grave, waiting to see if she would appear there instead of at the cemetery gates. Tuesday, 3 in the morning. I positioned myself near her headstone with a folding chair and a thermos of coffee, prepared to wait as long as necessary. At exactly 3:17, I felt a change in the air, a coolness that had nothing to do with the autumn weather, a sense of presence that made the hair on my arms stand up. And there she was, kneeling beside her own headstone, her navy blue coat unmistakable even in the darkness. But this time, she wasn't asking about Tommy. This time, she was talking to him. "I'm sorry, mein Liebster," she whispered, her voice carrying clearly in the still night air. "I looked everywhere for you, but they moved things around. They moved everything around, and now I can't remember where they put you. But I'm still looking, Tommy. Mama is still looking for you." I watched as she reached into her coat pocket and pulled out something small, a child's toy car, red and worn with age, the kind of toy a 7-year-old boy might have treasured in 1938. She placed it carefully on the grass near her headstone, as if leaving it for someone who might come looking for it. "I know you're here somewhere," she continued, her voice breaking with grief that had apparently survived death itself. "They told me you were here, but everything looks different now. Different names, different stones, everything moved around. But I won't stop looking, mein Sohn. I promise I won't stop looking." She stood slowly, her movements careful and deliberate, and began walking toward the section where Tommy's unmarked grave lay forgotten beneath well-maintained grass. I followed at a distance, watching as she searched the same empty ground where her son rested without monument or marker. For an hour, She walked back and forth across that patch of lawn, calling his name softly, leaving small toys and trinkets in places that seemed significant to her, but meaningless to anyone else. Finally, as the sky began to lighten with the approach of dawn, she returned to the cemetery gates and faded into the morning mist, already gone by the time the sun touched the horizon. The next day, I visited plot 112 with a metal detector, searching for any trace of Thomas Mueller's forgotten grave. 6 feet down, the detector picked up something metallic, probably the remains of his casket hardware, corroded by decades underground but still detectable. Tommy was there, exactly where his mother believed him to be, beneath grass that grew greener and thicker than anywhere else in Section C. I petitioned the cemetery board to install a proper headstone for Thomas Mueller using funds from the memorial restoration budget. The stone was simple, but dignified. Tommy Mueller, beloved son, 1931 to 1938. Beneath his name, I had them carve a small toy car, identical to the ones his mother left for him, week after week. The following Tuesday, I waited at the cemetery gates at 3:17 in the morning, expecting to see Anna Mueller appear with her familiar question about her lost boy. But this time, she approached the gates with a different expression, not the desperate searching of previous visits, but something closer to peace. "Excuse me," she said, her voice still trembling but now with relief rather than anxiety. "I think I found my Tommy. There's a stone there now, with his name on it, and a little car just like the one I gave him for his birthday. He always loved that car." I smiled, though I'm not sure she could see me clearly in the darkness. "Yes," I said, "Tommy is exactly where he should be. He's been waiting for you to find him." She nodded, tears streaming down her face, and for the first time in all our encounters, she seemed truly present, fully there, rather than caught between worlds. "Thank you," she whispered, "for helping me bring my boy home." Anna Mueller never appeared at the gates again. But sometimes, on Tuesday nights when the air is still and the cemetery lies quiet under starlight, I walk past Thomas Mueller's grave and find fresh toys placed carefully on the grass, small cars, and wooden soldiers. The kinds of gifts a loving mother might leave for a 7-year-old boy who has all the time in the world to play. Sometimes the dead are more considerate than the living, changing into their most comfortable clothes before settling in for the long sleep. My name is Luis Santos, and I've been driving transport for Riverside Funeral Services for 11 years. It's not glamorous work moving bodies from hospitals to funeral homes, from funeral homes to cemeteries, handling the logistics that families never want to think about during their darkest hours. But it's honest work, and it requires a certain respect for the dead that I've always taken seriously. Most people don't realize how much care goes into transporting the deceased. Every movement is deliberate, every detail documented. We treat each person as if they were our own family member, maintaining dignity even when no one is watching. That's why what happened with Mrs. Dorothy Kensington still bothers me 3 months later. Dorothy was 91 when she passed at St. Mary's Hospital on a quiet Sunday morning in January. Natural causes, peaceful passing, surrounded by her children and grandchildren. She'd been a seamstress her whole life, known for her attention to detail and her particular way of doing things. Her daughter, Marie, told me that Dorothy had been very specific about what she wanted to wear for her final viewing. "She picked out this blue dress months ago," Marie explained as we prepared for transport. "Said it was her favorite, the one that made her feel most like herself." She was always so particular about her appearance. Even at 91, never left the house unless she looked just right. I helped load Dorothy into the transport vehicle, noting the beautiful blue dress with small white flowers that her family had chosen. It was elegant and dignified, exactly the kind of outfit a woman like Dorothy would have selected for such an important occasion. The funeral was scheduled for the following Thursday, with burial at Oakwood Cemetery immediately afterward. The service was lovely standing room only, testament to a life well lived and a woman who had touched many hearts. Dorothy looked peaceful in her blue dress, surrounded by flowers and photographs that captured decades of joy and achievement. After the service, I carefully transferred her casket to the hearse for the final journey to Oakwood. The burial proceeded normally. Dorothy was laid to rest in a family plot beside her husband of 68 years, with words of comfort from Pastor Williams and tears from family members who would miss her terribly. I watched as the casket was lowered into the ground, making sure everything was handled with the proper respect and care. 6 weeks later, I received an unusual call. Legal complications had arisen regarding Dorothy's will. Something about property deeds and inheritance disputes that required exhumation for formal identification. These situations are rare, but not unheard of, and they always involve extensive paperwork and court orders to ensure everything is done properly. I was assigned to handle the transport from Oakwood back to Riverside for the identification process. The exhumation was scheduled for early morning, before the cemetery opened to visitors. When we lifted Dorothy's casket from the ground, I noticed it felt exactly the same weight as when we'd buried her, solid, substantial, properly balanced. Back at Riverside, the court-appointed medical examiner needed to open the casket for formal identification before the legal proceedings could continue. Standard procedure, even though we all knew who was inside. I helped position the casket in the preparation room and stepped back while the examiner did his work. When he lifted the upper portion of the casket, I heard him make a small sound of surprise. "That's interesting," he murmured, more to himself than to anyone else in the room. I stepped forward to see what had caught his attention, expecting perhaps some minor shifting that had occurred during the burial process. But what I saw made me question everything I thought I knew about postmortem care. Dorothy Kensington was no longer wearing the blue dress with white flowers. Instead, she was dressed in a simple white cotton nightgown, the kind elderly women wear for comfort rather than appearance. It was clean and pressed, as if someone had carefully changed her clothes while she slept. "Was she buried in a nightgown?" the examiner asked, consulting his notes. "No," I replied, my voice sounding strange in my own ears. "Definitely not. Blue dress with small white flowers." I transported her myself, saw her at the viewing, helped load the casket for burial. She was wearing a blue dress. The examiner frowned, checking his paperwork again. Could there have been a mistake during preparation? Sometimes families change their minds about burial clothes at the last minute, but I knew there had been no mistake. I'd seen Dorothy Kensington in that blue dress at every stage of the process, during transport, during the viewing, during the burial service. The dress had been carefully chosen, lovingly selected by a family who wanted their matriarch to look her absolute best for her final appearance. Marie Kensington was called to provide formal identification. When she arrived and saw her mother in the white nightgown, her face went pale with confusion and something that might have been recognition. That's her nightgown," Marie whispered, reaching out to touch the soft cotton fabric, the one she wore every night for the last 10 years of her life. She said it was the most comfortable thing she owned, that it made her feel safe and peaceful when she went to sleep. "But she wasn't buried in a nightgown," I said, trying to make sense of what we were seeing. "She was definitely wearing the blue dress. I saw it myself." Marie nodded, tears starting to form in her eyes. "I know. We dressed her in the blue dress because that's what she said she wanted for the funeral. But this nightgown," she paused, touching the fabric again with trembling fingers. "This is what she would have chosen for sleeping. She always said that dying was just like going to sleep, except you didn't wake up in the morning." The medical examiner completed his identification and prepared to close the casket. But Marie asked for a moment alone with her mother. I stepped outside the preparation room, giving her privacy for what I assumed would be a brief goodbye. Instead, I heard her talking, having a conversation as if Dorothy could hear and respond. "Oh, Mama," Marie said, her voice mixing laughter and tears, "you always were particular about being comfortable. Even now, you had to change into your nightgown for sleeping. didn't you? Later, as I prepared to transport Dorothy back to Oakwood for reburial, Marie pulled me aside with an expression that mixed amazement with a kind of peaceful acceptance. "My mother was the most particular woman you'd ever meet," she said. "Everything had to be just so, especially when it came to clothes. She had day clothes and night clothes, and she never mixed them up, not once in all the years I knew her. The blue dress was perfect for the funeral, for saying goodbye to everyone, but for sleeping," she gestured toward the casket. "For sleeping, she'd want to be comfortable." During the drive back to Oakwood, I found myself thinking about comfort and consideration, about the idea that some people maintain their personal preferences even after death. Dorothy had been buried in clothes appropriate for a public viewing, but somehow impossibly she'd changed into what felt right for the long sleep ahead. The reburial was quiet, attended only by Marie and a few close family members. As they lowered Dorothy's casket into the ground for the second time, Marie spoke a few words that stayed with me. "Sleep well, Mama. You're dressed just the way you like, and you can rest as long as you need to. I've transported hundreds of people in my 11 years on this job, but Dorothy Kensington taught me something new about death and dignity, and the importance of being comfortable in your own skin, or in her case, in your favorite nightgown. Some things are more important than appearances, and sometimes the dead know better than the living what they need for the journey ahead." The blue dress was never found. We searched the casket thoroughly, checked with the funeral home staff, even contacted the cemetery to see if it had somehow been misplaced during the burial process. But it had simply disappeared, as if Dorothy had carefully folded it away somewhere safe, the way she'd done every night for 91 years before changing into something more appropriate for sleep. Marie kept the nightgown after the second burial, saying it felt like a final gift from her mother, proof that even in death, Dorothy was still taking care of herself, still making the practical choices that had defined her long and well-ordered life. And sometimes, late at night when I'm finishing a transport run and the world is quiet, I think about Dorothy sleeping peacefully in Oakwood Cemetery, comfortable at last in clothes that feel like home. The dead usually don't leave forwarding addresses, but sometimes they remember places the living have forgotten. My name is Janet Williams, and I've been keeping records for Hillcrest Memorial Gardens for 19 years. It's meticulous work tracking every burial, maintaining family plots, ensuring that every detail is documented correctly for posterity. I take pride in accuracy, in creating records that families can rely on decades after their loved ones have passed. But sometimes the records create themselves in ways that challenge everything I thought I knew about death and memory. Robert Morrison came to us on a gray Tuesday morning in March. 73 years old, retired postal worker, survived by his wife Ellen and 2 grown children who lived across the country. He'd suffered a heart attack while tending his garden, sudden but peaceful, according to the paramedics who found him among the tomato plants he'd been so proud of. The funeral was small but meaningful. Robert had been a quiet man who preferred books to crowds, gardening to socializing, the kind of person who left gentle impressions rather than bold statements. His family spoke about his love of reading, his careful attention to detail, and his habit of making lists for everything: grocery trips, garden plans, books he wanted to read before winter arrived. Ellen chose a simple gray suit for the burial, one that Robert had worn to their daughter's wedding 5 years earlier. She asked me to make sure his reading glasses were positioned correctly, and that his favorite pen was placed in his jacket pocket, a blue ballpoint that he'd used for decades to make his careful notes and observations. The burial proceeded without incident. Robert was laid to rest in Section B, beneath an oak tree that would shade his grave during the hot summer months. Ellen visited twice a week, bringing fresh flowers and occasionally a new book to place on his headstone, as if he might somehow be able to read it wherever he'd gone. 4 months later, the city contacted us about a property dispute involving land that had once belonged to the Morrison family. Legal complications dating back generations. Something about mineral rights and boundary disputes that required exhuming Robert for formal identification before the court proceedings could begin. I prepared all the necessary paperwork, coordinating with the court officials and the exhumation crew. These legal requirements are tedious but important, ensuring that every detail is documented, every procedure followed, exactly as mandated by law. Robert's exhumation was scheduled for early morning, before the cemetery opened to regular visitors. When they opened the casket for identification, everything appeared exactly as it should. Robert looked peaceful, his gray suit still neat and dignified, his reading glasses positioned correctly on his face. But when the court official reached for the identification documents, he made a discovery that left everyone in the preparation room confused and unsettled. In Robert's jacket pocket, alongside his favorite blue pen, was a folded piece of paper that hadn't been there during the burial. It was filled with handwriting, neat, careful script that Ellen immediately identified as her husband's distinctive penmanship. But the paper itself was different from anything Robert had owned, newer and whiter than the yellowed notebooks he'd preferred during his lifetime. The writing was even more puzzling. It consisted of detailed directions to a house that none of us recognized. Take Maple Street east, past the old railroad bridge, turn left at the yellow house with the green shutters, follow the dirt road until you reach the farmhouse with the red barn. Look for the garden behind the house, third row from the back fence, beneath the largest tomato plant. Ellen studied the directions with growing bewilderment. "This isn't any place I know," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Robert never mentioned a farmhouse with a red barn, and we've lived in the same neighborhood for 47 years. But this is definitely his handwriting. I'd recognize it anywhere." The court official made photocopies of the note for the legal file, but Ellen asked to keep the original. As we prepared to close the casket for reburial, she noticed something else that made her catch her breath sharply. "The date," she whispered, pointing to the top corner of the paper where Robert had written his customary date notation. "Look at the date he wrote." The date was clearly visible in Robert's precise handwriting. July 15th, 2024, exactly 3 weeks after his death, written in the same blue ink from the pen that had been buried with him. I checked our burial records to confirm the timeline. Robert Morrison had died on June 20th and been buried on June 24th. There was no way he could have written anything dated July 15th, yet there it was in his own unmistakable handwriting, on paper that looked far too fresh to have been underground for 4 months. Ellen asked me to help her follow the directions, to see if they led anywhere real, or if they were perhaps the confused wanderings of a dying mind, somehow preserved on paper. I agreed, partly out of professional curiosity, and partly because Ellen seemed to need the closure that answers might provide. We drove through town following Robert's careful directions, starting on Maple Street and heading east, past landmarks that were indeed exactly as he'd described them. The old railroad bridge, the yellow house with green shutters, the dirt road that branched off toward what looked like undeveloped farmland. The farmhouse appeared at the end of the dirt road exactly as Robert had written, white clapboard siding, red barn behind it, and a garden plot that stretched toward a weathered back fence. The current owners, an elderly couple named Patterson, were surprised but welcoming when Ellen explained our unusual situation. "Oh my," said Mrs. Patterson when she heard Robert's name. "You mean Bobby Morrison? We haven't seen him in, oh, it must be 40 years or more. Used to come out here every summer when he was just a boy, back when his grandfather owned this place." Ellen stared at her in amazement. Robert never mentioned having family who owned a farm. I thought I knew everything about his childhood. Mr. Patterson nodded, gesturing toward the garden plot. Bobby's grandfather raised him for a few years after his parents died in that car accident. Terrible thing. Bobby was maybe 8 or 9 years old, loved working in the garden, had a real talent for growing tomatoes, that boy did. He led us to the back of the garden, to the third row from the fence exactly as Robert's directions had specified. Beneath the largest tomato plant, the soil looked different, darker, richer. as if it had been recently disturbed. "Funny thing," Mr. Patterson continued. "We found something buried here just last week. Been meaning to ask around town if anyone knew what it might be." He disappeared into the house and returned with a small metal box, rusted with age, but still intact. Inside the box were items that clearly belonged to Robert's childhood. A child's reading glasses, several composition notebooks filled with a young boy's careful observations about gardening, and photographs of a thin child working alongside an elderly man among rows of tomato plants. Ellen examined the photographs with tears streaming down her face. "That's Robert," she whispered. "But he looks so young. And that must be his grandfather. Robert told me his grandfather died when he was 10, but he never talked about living here, never mentioned the farm." Mrs. Patterson smiled sadly. Bobby was heartbroken when his grandfather passed. Had to go live with relatives in town. Never came back to visit. But he loved this place, especially the garden. Always said he'd return someday to tend the tomatoes the way his grandfather taught him. The notebooks contained detailed records of garden work, weather observations, and crop rotations, all written in handwriting that was unmistakably Robert's, even accounting for the difference between a child's writing and an adult's refined script. The last entry was dated simply summer 1959, the year Robert's grandfather had died. As we prepared to leave, Ellen asked the Pattersons if they would mind if she visited occasionally to tend the tomato plants in Robert's memory. They agreed enthusiastically, saying the garden had been flourishing unusually well this season, producing the best tomatoes they'd seen in decades. During the drive back to town, Ellen was quiet for a long time before finally speaking. "He went home," she said simply. "Somehow, after all these years, Robert found his way back to the place he'd been happiest as a child. And he left me directions so I could find it too." We reburied Robert that afternoon, but Ellen kept his handwritten directions in her purse, along with the photographs from the metal box. She started visiting the Patterson farm every week, working in the garden, and learning the techniques that Robert's grandfather had taught him so many decades earlier. The tomato plants thrived under her care, producing fruit that the Pattersons swore tasted exactly like the tomatoes Bobby Morrison used to grow as a boy. And sometimes, when Ellen was working in the garden during the quiet hours of late afternoon, she said she could feel Robert there with her, finally at peace, in the place where his childhood had been happiest. I updated Robert's file to include the strange circumstances of the directions and the discovery of his childhood home. It's not the kind of information that typically goes in cemetery records, but some stories are too important to lose to administrative efficiency. And now, whenever families ask me about maintaining connections with their loved ones after death, I tell them about Robert Morrison and the directions he left to guide his wife back to the garden where his heart had always remained. Some people never miss a weekly appointment, even when keeping it should be impossible. My name is Carl Brennan, and I've been working the night shift at Meadowbrook Cemetery for 14 years. It's quiet work patrolling the grounds, checking for vandalism, making sure the electronic systems are functioning properly. Most nights pass without incident, just me and the peaceful silence of a place where thousands rest undisturbed. But some nights, the silence gets interrupted by visitors who shouldn't be able to visit anymore. It started during my 3rd year on the job, always on Thursday nights around 2 in the morning. I'd be making my regular rounds when I'd notice fresh flowers on grave 112 white daisies, usually a dozen, arranged in a simple glass vase that appeared to be quite old. The flowers were always fresh, petals bright and stems green, as if they'd been cut that very day. Grave 112 belongs to Margaret Chen, age 29, buried in 1997 after a brief battle with cancer. According to our records, she had no surviving family, parents deceased, no siblings, never married, no children. The plot had been purchased by her employer, a kindly woman who wanted to ensure Margaret had a proper resting place. But for the past 11 years, someone had been visiting every Thursday, leaving those perfect white daisies. I started paying closer attention, arriving at that section of the cemetery earlier in my rounds, hoping to catch whoever was making these mysterious visits. The security cameras covered most of the cemetery grounds, but grave 112 was positioned in a blind spot between two large oak trees that blocked the electronic surveillance. Week after week, the same pattern continued. I'd patrol the area at 1:30, finding no flowers. By 2:30, the daisies would be there fresh, beautiful, arranged with obvious care and affection. But I never saw anyone come or go, never heard footsteps or car doors, never caught even a glimpse of Margaret Chen's devoted visitor. The mystery deepened when I realized that the flowers weren't just appearing. They were being placed with intimate knowledge of Margaret's preferences. According to the groundskeeper who'd worked here during Margaret's burial, she'd specifically requested that any flowers left on her grave be white daisies, her favorite flower since childhood. But this information wasn't public knowledge, wasn't recorded anywhere that a casual visitor could access it. I decided to set up my own surveillance system, using a small digital camera with night vision capabilities. I positioned it in a tree, about 30 yards from grave 112, camouflaged among the branches, but with a clear view of the headstone. If someone was visiting Margaret's grave every Thursday night, I was determined to find out who. The footage I retrieved the following Friday morning showed something that challenged everything I thought I understood about cemetery security and the nature of grief itself. At exactly 2:17 in the morning, a figure approached Margaret's grave, a young woman with long dark hair, wearing a simple white dress that seemed to glow faintly in the infrared recording. She moved with obvious familiarity, walking directly to the headstone without hesitation, carrying a bouquet of white daisies that she arranged carefully in the old glass vase. But what struck me most was her behavior at the gravesite. She knelt beside the headstone and appeared to be having a conversation, not the one-sided talking that grieving visitors sometimes do, but an actual dialogue, with pauses as if she were listening to responses. The recording lasted for nearly an hour, showing the woman tending to the gravesite, adjusting the flowers, cleaning dirt from the headstone, and maintaining what appeared to be an animated conversation with Margaret Chen. Finally, as the sky began to show the first hints of dawn, she stood, kissed her fingertips, and pressed them to the headstone before walking away into the morning mist. I reviewed the footage dozens of times, trying to identify the mysterious visitor. She appeared to be in her 30s, with delicate features and a gentle manner that suggested deep affection for the person buried in grave 112. But there was something unusual about the recording itself. The woman's image seemed slightly translucent, as if the camera was having trouble focusing on her, and her movements had an ethereal quality that made me wonder if the equipment was malfunctioning. The following Thursday, I positioned myself with binoculars in a location where I could observe grave 112 directly, hoping to get a better look at Margaret's visitor. At 2:17, exactly as the camera had recorded, I saw the same young woman approach the headstone carrying fresh daisies. But what I witnessed through the binoculars made me question my own sanity. The woman was definitely there. I could see her clearly, watch her arrange the flowers, observe her tender ministrations to the gravesite. But when I lowered the binoculars and looked with my naked eyes, I saw nothing. No woman, no visitor, no movement at all. Just an empty cemetery and a headstone that somehow now had fresh flowers beside it. I raised the binoculars again, and there she was, still kneeling beside the grave, still carrying on her weekly conversation with Margaret Chen. It was as if she existed in a frequency that could only be detected through the lenses, invisible to direct observation, but undeniably present to enhanced vision. Troubled by what I'd witnessed, I researched Margaret Chen's background more thoroughly, looking for any clues that might explain the identity of her devoted visitor. In the newspaper archives from 1997, I found Margaret's obituary and a small collection of articles about her brief life. Margaret had been a teacher at Riverside Elementary School, known for her kindness and her special attention to students who struggled academically or socially. One article mentioned her close friendship with a fellow teacher named Sarah Williams, who had spoken movingly at Margaret's funeral about their bond and the loss her death represented. I located Sarah Williams through the school district records. She was still teaching at Riverside Elementary, now in her early 50s, and she agreed to meet with me when I explained my unusual situation. When I showed her the camera footage of the weekly visitor, her reaction was immediate and emotional. "Oh my God," Sarah whispered, her hand covering her mouth. "That's me. That's me when I was younger. When Margaret and I first became friends." She studied the image more closely, tears forming in her eyes. "But that's impossible. I haven't been to the cemetery in years. I mean, I think about visiting every week, especially on Thursdays. That was our day to have coffee together after work, but I never actually go." Sarah explained that she and Margaret had been inseparable for the 3 years they'd worked together before Margaret's diagnosis. They'd shared everything: teaching strategies, personal problems, dreams for the future. Margaret's death had devastated Sarah, who'd felt like she was losing a sister. "I always meant to visit more often," Sarah continued, "but it was too painful. So instead, I'd light a candle every Thursday night and think about her. Remember our conversations. Imagine what I would say if I could talk to her one more time. I'd picture myself bringing her white daisies. Those were always her favorites, and spending time with her at the cemetery." The realization was both beautiful and unsettling. Sarah's weekly ritual of remembrance, her Thursday night vigils of love and longing, had somehow manifested as actual visits to Margaret's grave. Her grief had become so powerful, her connection to her deceased friend so strong, that it had created a version of herself that could cross the barrier between the living and the dead. I shared this discovery with Sarah, who decided to start making actual visits to the cemetery on Thursday nights, bringing real white daisies to complement the phantom flowers that appeared through her unconscious devotion. The first time she visited in person, she said the experience felt remarkably familiar, as if she'd been making the journey for years. During our last conversation, Sarah told me something that still gives me chills. "When I'm there at the grave," she said, "I can hear Margaret responding to me. Not with words, exactly, but I know what she's thinking, what she wants to tell me. It's like our friendship never really ended. It just moved to a different place, a different way of being together. I still work the night shift at Meadowbrook Cemetery, and I still see the phantom visitor at grave 112 every Thursday night. Sometimes through binoculars, sometimes caught on infrared camera, always tending to Margaret Chen with the same gentle devotion. But now I also see Sarah Williams making her own weekly pilgrimage, bringing real flowers to complement the spiritual ones, maintaining a friendship that has somehow transcended the boundaries of life and death. The white daisies continue to appear like clockwork, fresh and beautiful, arranged with love by hands that exist somewhere between memory and reality. And I've learned that some appointments are too important to be canceled by something as minor as death, that some friendships are strong enough to create their own visiting hours in the space between what is and what should be. The old safety systems never really go away. They just wait underground for someone who might still need them. My name is Pete Sullivan, and I've been maintaining the mechanical systems at Riverside Cemetery for 26 years. Most people don't realize how much infrastructure exists beneath: cemetery grounds, irrigation systems, drainage networks, electrical conduits for lighting and security. But the oldest and most unsettling remnants are the safety bell systems, installed decades ago when people still feared being buried alive. The Victorian era left us with many strange practices, but few were as haunting as the safety bell's mechanical systems that connected the inside of a coffin to a bell mounted above ground, allowing anyone mistakenly buried alive to signal for help. Most cemeteries removed these systems by the 1950s, when modern medical practices made premature burial virtually impossible. Riverside removed our last safety bells in 1962, 40 years before I ever started working here. That's why I was so surprised to find Harold Whitman buried with a bell string still clutched in his right hand. Harold was exhumed on a gray morning in November. For reasons I never fully understood, something about insurance claims and legal complications that required formal identification of the remains. He'd been buried for 8 months, standard interment in our newer section, where the safety bell systems had never been installed. The exhumation crew was efficient and respectful, treating Harold's remains with the dignity due to any person being temporarily disturbed from their rest. When they opened the casket for identification, everything appeared normal at first. Harold looked peaceful, his hands folded across his chest exactly as they'd been positioned during the burial ceremony. But as I helped document the contents for the legal paperwork, I noticed something that made me pause and look more closely. In Harold's right hand, partially hidden beneath the silk lining of the casket, was a length of rope, the braided cord that looked like it belonged to the Victorian safety bell systems we'd removed decades before Harold was ever buried. The rope was clutched tightly in his fingers, as if he'd been gripping it with considerable force. "That's strange," muttered the court official overseeing the identification. Was he buried with rope in his hand? I checked the burial documentation, but there was no mention of rope or cord among Harold's personal effects. His family had chosen simple burial, no jewelry, no keepsakes, just Harold in his best suit, with his hands folded respectfully. Certainly no Victorian-era bell rope that shouldn't have existed anywhere in our cemetery. But the rope was definitely there, and it showed clear signs of use. The braided fibers were frayed at one end, as if they'd been pulled repeatedly, and there were stress marks that indicated significant tension. Most unsettling was the condition of Harold's hand itself. His grip on the rope was so tight that rigor mortis had locked his fingers around it, creating a permanent clasp that looked both desperate and determined. I decided to investigate the rope's possible origin, checking our historical records for information about the old safety bell systems. In the archives, I found installation diagrams from the 1920s showing the locations of all 47 safety bells that had once been mounted throughout Riverside Cemetery. According to the removal documentation from 1962, every bell and rope system had been dismantled and disposed of. But when I plotted Harold Whitman's burial location against the old installation map, I discovered something that made my hands shake. As I held the faded blueprints, Harold was buried in the exact location where safety bell number 33 had been installed in 1924 and removed in 1962, 40 years before Harold's death. Decades before he'd ever set foot in Riverside Cemetery. I decided to examine the burial site more closely, looking for any traces of the old bell system that might explain how Harold had ended up with a rope in his hand. Using a metal detector, I scanned the area around his grave, searching for buried hardware or mounting brackets that might have been left behind during the removal process. 6 feet above Harold's head, right where the safety bell should have been mounted, my metal detector found something substantial buried about 18 inches underground. Careful excavation revealed a cast iron bell, green with age but still intact, connected to a rope system that descended directly down to the level where Harold's casket rested. The bell itself was fascinating, a Victorian masterpiece of mechanical engineering, designed to amplify even the slightest pull from the rope below. More remarkable was its condition. Despite being buried for over 60 years, the bell mechanism still functioned perfectly. When I tested the rope connection, the bell rang with clear, haunting tones that seemed to echo across the entire cemetery. But the most unsettling discovery was the evidence of recent use. The bell showed clear signs of having been rung repeatedly. The metal surfaces were polished, bright where the clapper had struck the sides, and the rope showed wear patterns consistent with frequent pulling. According to the cemetery's incident logs, night security had reported hearing unexplained bell sounds for several months, always between midnight and dawn. always from the vicinity of Harold's grave. I consulted with the cemetery's historical society, hoping to learn more about safety bell protocols and the psychological impact of Victorian burial practices. What I learned made Harold's situation even more poignant and disturbing. Harold Whitman had been born in 1938, making him 24 years old, when Riverside removed its safety bell systems in 1962. As a young man, he would have grown up knowing that safety bells existed, understanding their purpose, perhaps even fearing the possibility of premature burial that had terrified previous generations. More significantly, Harold had suffered from severe claustrophobia in his entire adult life, a condition documented in his medical records and mentioned by his family during the funeral arrangements. His daughter had specifically requested that his casket be left open for as long as possible during the viewing, knowing how much her father had feared enclosed spaces. The picture that emerged was heartbreaking. A man with lifelong claustrophobia, buried in the exact location where a safety system had once provided reassurance to others with similar fears, somehow managing to connect with that protection even decades after it had been officially removed. Harold's desperate grip on the bell rope suggested that he'd been trying to communicate, trying to signal that he was aware and in need of help. I shared my findings with the cemetery director, who decided that Harold should be reburied with the safety bell system restored to full functionality. It seemed like the compassionate response to a man who had clearly been seeking the comfort and security that the Victorian system was designed to provide. The reburial ceremony was small but meaningful. Harold's daughter, who had learned about our discoveries, thanked us for understanding her father's needs even in death. As we lowered his casket into the ground, she made a request that surprised everyone present. "Please leave the bell rope in his hand," she said quietly. "If he needs it, I want him to have it." The safety bell was reinstalled, according to the original 1924 specifications, with the rope connection running directly to Harold's casket. We tested the system thoroughly, ensuring that even the slightest movement would ring the bell above ground. The cemetery's night security was instructed to respond immediately to any sounds from that location. Harold has been reburied for 6 months now, and the bell has remained silent. But sometimes, during the quiet hours between midnight and dawn, I walk past his grave and notice that the bell rope above ground seems to move slightly in breezes that don't affect anything else in the cemetery. And the metal surfaces of the bell itself continue to show signs of polishing, as if the clapper strikes the sides regularly, though no sound ever reaches the surface. I've come to believe that Harold isn't trying to escape, he's simply testing the system, making sure it works, finding comfort in the knowledge that if he ever needs help, the bell is there waiting for him. The rope in his hand isn't a cry for rescue, it's a security blanket, a connection to the surface world that allows him to rest peacefully, knowing he's not truly alone in the dark. The other maintenance workers think I'm being overly sentimental about a dead man and some old equipment, but they didn't see the desperate grip Harold had on that rope, didn't spend hours researching the psychology of claustrophobia and the Victorian fear of premature burial. They don't understand that sometimes the most important part of any safety system isn't whether it's actually needed, it's simply knowing that it's there. I maintain the bell system now as part of my regular duties, checking the rope tension, ensuring the mechanism operates smoothly, keeping everything in perfect working order. It's not officially part of my job description, but it feels like the right thing to do for a man who spent his whole life fearing enclosed spaces and finally found a way to rest peacefully. And on those rare nights when I'm working late and the cemetery is especially quiet, I sometimes hear what might be a very soft ringing coming from the direction of Harold's grave, not the loud alarm the bell was designed to produce, but a gentle chiming that sounds almost like contentment, like someone testing a favorite musical instrument just to hear its familiar voice. Harold Whitman never needed to be rescued from his grave, but he needed to know that rescue was possible. Sometimes that's enough. Sometimes knowing you can call for help is more important than ever having to make the call. And sometimes the dead are wiser than the living about what they need to feel safe in the long darkness that awaits us all. Some people have such strong habits that even death can't break them. They'll rearrange themselves for the sunrise, no matter where they are. My name is Director Williams, and I've been overseeing burials at Sunset Memorial Park for 23 years. In that time, I've learned that every family has its traditions, its particular ways of honoring the dead that reflect cultural heritage, religious beliefs, or personal preferences. Some want elaborate ceremonies. Others prefer simple dignity. But few traditions are as specific as the Kowalski family's insistence that their loved ones always face west toward the setting Sunday. Anna Kowalski was buried on a crisp October morning, according to her family's century-old tradition. 96 years old, she'd lived through the Great Depression, World War II, and the births of 17 grandchildren and great-grandchildren. Her funeral was a celebration of a life fully lived, attended by 4 generations of Kowalskis who spoke with pride about their matriarch's strength, wisdom, and unwavering devotion to family customs. She always faced west, explained her son Michael as we prepared for the burial service. Every night when she went to sleep, every morning when she said her prayers, every time she sat on the porch in the evening. She said it reminded her of her parents and grandparents, all facing west toward the sunset when their time came. It's been our family tradition for over 100 years. I ensured that Anna's casket was positioned according to the family's wishes, head pointing west, feet pointing east, so that she would face the sunset for eternity. The burial proceeded beautifully, with traditional Polish prayers and songs that honored both Anna's heritage and her family's long-standing customs. As we lowered her casket into the ground, Michael sprinkled soil from the old family farm over the coffin, maintaining a connection to the land where the westward-facing tradition had begun. The exhumation order came 6 months later. Legal complications involving inheritance and property disputes required temporary relocation, while lawyers sorted through complex family trusts and land ownership issues. These situations are always delicate, involving not just legal requirements, but deep family emotions about disturbing a loved one's rest. I coordinated with the court officials and the exhumation crew, ensuring that every aspect of the process would be handled with the same respect and dignity that had characterized Anna's original burial. The Kowalski family gathered to witness the exhumation, wanting to maintain their watchful care over their matriarch even during this temporary disruption. When we opened Anna's casket for the required identification, everything appeared normal at first glance. She looked peaceful and dignified, exactly as she had during the original viewing 6 months earlier. But as I examined the positioning for documentation purposes, I noticed something that made me pause and look more carefully. Anna Kowalski was no longer facing west toward the sunset. Somehow, impossibly, her entire body had rotated within the casket so that she now faced east toward the sunrise. Not just her head, her entire body had shifted position, as if she had carefully rearranged herself during the months underground. Michael noticed my hesitation immediately. "What is it, Director Williams? Is something wrong with our grandmother?" I tried to maintain my professional composure while processing what I was seeing. The positioning appears to have shifted slightly. Sometimes settling occurs over time, especially in older caskets. But even as I offered this explanation, I knew it didn't make sense. Bodies don't rotate themselves within caskets, and there were no signs of external disturbance or structural failure. Michael stepped closer to examine his grandmother's positioning, and his face went pale with recognition. "She's facing east," he whispered, his voice mixing confusion with something that might have been understanding. "She's facing the sunrise instead of the sunset." Other family members gathered around the casket, all of them noticing the dramatic change in Anna's orientation. The westward-facing tradition was so fundamental to their family identity that everyone immediately recognized the significance of the shift. But how is that possible? asked Michael's daughter, Sarah, a nurse who understood anatomy and decomposition better than most. Bodies don't just turn around by themselves. And look, she's not just rotated, she's perfectly positioned, like someone carefully arranged her to face east. I examined the casket interior more closely, looking for any signs that might explain the repositioning. The silk lining showed no tears or disruption, the padding remained smooth and undisturbed, and Anna's burial clothes were neat and properly arranged. It was as if she had simply turned over in her sleep, adjusting her position for comfort. But the most puzzling aspect was the deliberate nature of the positioning. Anna wasn't just randomly rotated, she was perfectly aligned to face due east, positioned with the same careful attention to direction that her family had maintained for generations. Someone or something had rearranged her with precise knowledge of compass directions and burial customs. That evening, I met with Michael Kowalski privately to discuss the unusual circumstances of his grandmother's positioning. As we talked, he shared family stories that provided context for what we had witnessed, stories that made Anna's eastward turn seem less mysterious and more meaningful. My grandmother was always the first person awake in our house, Michael explained. Every morning, for as long as I can remember, she'd get up before dawn and sit by the east window, waiting for the sunrise. She said it reminded her of new beginnings, of hope and possibility. But she also maintained the westward tradition because that's what the family had always done. He paused, looking out the window toward where the sun had set hours earlier. Near the end, when she was getting sicker, she started talking about wanting to see the sunrise one more time. She said she'd spent her whole life facing west toward endings, but now she wanted to face east toward whatever came next. This revelation cast Anna's repositioning in an entirely different light. Rather than a mysterious disturbance, it seemed like a final expression of personal choice, a decision to break with family tradition in favor of personal preference. Anna Kowalski had spent 96 years honoring her ancestors by facing west, but in death, she had chosen to face east, toward the promise of dawn. The family decided to respect Anna's apparent preference, burying her in her new eastward-facing position when the legal complications were resolved. But they also decided to modify their family tradition, giving future generations the choice between facing west toward heritage or east toward hope. During the reburial ceremony, Michael spoke about his grandmother's courage in changing a 100-year-old tradition, about her final lesson that growth sometimes requires facing new directions. As we lowered her casket into the ground, this time positioned to face the sunrise, the entire Kowalski family turned east, watching the horizon where their matriarch would greet each new day. Anna Kowalski remained in her eastward position after reburial, and Michael began visiting her grave at dawn rather than dusk, honoring her choice to face the morning light. He told me that sitting by her grave during sunrise felt like continuing their old morning routine when she'd wait for the dawn while he prepared for another day. 6 months later, I received a call from Michael that still gives me chills. "Director Williams," he said, his voice mixing amazement with deep emotion, "I need to tell you something about my grandmother's grave. Every morning when I visit, there are fresh flowers on her headstone white roses that weren't there the night before, and they're always arranged to point east toward the sunrise, as if someone is helping her decorate for the dawn." I visited Anna's grave the following morning and found exactly what Michael had described. Fresh white roses, arranged with obvious care, positioned to catch the first light of sunrise. The security cameras showed no visitors during the night hours, no one approaching her grave with flowers or gardening tools. But as I stood there watching the sun rise over Anna Kowalski's eastward-facing grave, I understood that some changes are more powerful than tradition. Some personal choices transcend even death itself. Anna had spent nearly a century facing west toward endings, but when given the opportunity, she chose to face east, toward eternal mornings, toward the endless possibility of dawn breaking over the horizon of whatever comes next. And sometimes, on clear mornings when the light is especially beautiful. Visitors to Sunset Memorial Park report seeing an elderly woman sitting by the eastward grave in Section J, her face turned toward the sunrise, her expression peaceful and content as she waits for another day to begin. Some people rest heavier than others, and sometimes the weight shifts in ways that make you question everything you know about physics and death. My name is Marcus Thompson, and I've been digging graves and handling caskets at Elmwood Cemetery for 17 years. It's physical work that requires strength, precision, and respect for the deceased. Every casket has its own weight and balance, and after nearly 2 decades of lifting and lowering, I can judge the load before we even begin the process. But sometimes the math doesn't add up the way it should, and sometimes the dead surprise you with their restlessness. Mrs. Dorothy Henley came to us in early September, a small woman who'd lived 93 years with the kind of quiet dignity that makes people genuinely mourn her passing. She'd been a librarian for 40 years, never married, devoted her life to books and the children who visited her library every day after school. Her funeral was simple but well attended, with dozens of former students sharing stories about how she'd influenced their lives. The burial was routine until we began lowering her casket into the grave. Dorothy had been a tiny woman, barely 5 feet tall, maybe 90 pounds in life, so her casket should have felt manageable, even with my aging back and shoulders. But as we maneuvered the lowering device, something felt wrong about the distribution of weight. The casket felt too light at first, as if it might be empty rather than containing a human body. Then, suddenly, it became impossibly heavy, so heavy that our hydraulic system struggled to maintain control during the descent. The weight seemed to shift from one end of the casket to the other, as if Dorothy were moving around inside, repositioning herself for comfort. I mentioned this to my partner Jake, who'd been working gravesites even longer than I had. He nodded grimly, saying he'd felt the same strange weight variations. Like she can't decide where she wants to settle, he muttered, checking the lowering mechanism for mechanical problems that might explain the inconsistent load. We completed the burial without incident, but I made a mental note about the unusual weight distribution. In 17 years of handling caskets, I'd never experienced anything quite like it. The way Dorothy's casket seemed to have a mind of its own about where the weight should be concentrated. The exhumation order arrived 4 months later. Insurance complications and questions about her will required formal identification of the remains before the estate could be settled. These bureaucratic requirements are tedious but necessary, and I've learned to handle them with the same professionalism I bring to every aspect of cemetery work. The excavation went smoothly until we began lifting Dorothy's casket from the grave. Once again, the weight felt wrong, shifting and unpredictable in ways that made our equipment behave erratically. At first, the casket felt too light for its size, then suddenly became so heavy that our hydraulic lift struggled to raise it to ground level. "There's something moving around in there," Jake said quietly, his voice carrying the concern of a man who'd seen enough unusual situations to trust his instincts. "The weight keeps shifting from head to foot and back again, like she's trying to find a comfortable position." During transport to the preparation facility, the weight variations continued. The casket felt normal while we were moving it, but whenever we set it down, the balance seemed to shift. By the time we reached the identification area, I was convinced that something unusual was happening inside Dorothy Henley's casket. The court official overseeing the identification process noted our concerns about the weight distribution, but he needed to open the casket, regardless of any mechanical oddities. As I assisted with the identification procedure, I prepared myself for whatever we might find that could explain the strange load variations. When we opened the upper portion of Dorothy's casket, everything appeared normal at first glance. She looked peaceful and dignified, exactly as she had during the viewing 4 months earlier. But as I examined her positioning more carefully, I noticed something that made me understand why the weight had been shifting so dramatically. Dorothy's hands were folded differently than they had been during the burial. I remembered the positioning clearly, because I always pay attention to those details. They're part of maintaining dignity and respect for the deceased. During the burial, her hands had been folded across her chest in the traditional manner. Now, they were positioned at her sides, as if she'd moved them for comfort. More significantly, her entire body appeared to have shifted within the casket. Instead of lying flat on her back, as she'd been positioned during burial, Dorothy was now resting slightly on her side, not dramatically, but enough to change the weight distribution and explain the shifting loads we'd experienced during both burial and exhumation. "Did anyone adjust the positioning after the burial?" asked the court official, examining Dorothy's posture with professional interest. "No," I replied, checking the burial documentation to confirm. She was positioned exactly according to family preferences and standard practices. No one has accessed this casket since the burial 4 months ago. But the evidence was undeniable. Dorothy Henley had somehow repositioned herself within the casket, moving from the formal burial posture to something that looked more natural and comfortable, the way a person might adjust their position while settling in for a long rest. The court official completed his identification and prepared to close the casket, but I asked for a moment to examine the positioning more carefully. As someone who'd handled thousands of burials, I wanted to understand how this shift could have occurred without external intervention. What I discovered made the mystery even more intriguing. Dorothy wasn't just randomly shifted. She was positioned exactly the way a person would lie while reading a book. Her head was tilted slightly to the right, her arms positioned as if holding something, her entire posture suggesting someone who'd settled in for a comfortable reading session. She was a librarian, I told the court official, sharing what I'd learned about Dorothy's background. Spent 40 years helping people find books. Probably spent countless hours reading herself. This positioning, it looks like she's arranged herself for reading. Later that day, I spoke with Dorothy's niece, the only surviving family member, about the unusual positioning we'd discovered. When I described how Dorothy had apparently rearranged herself within the casket, her niece smiled with recognition and something that looked like relief. "That sounds exactly like Aunt Dorothy," she said. "She never could get comfortable unless she was positioned just right for reading. Even in the hospital during her final days, she'd adjust her position constantly until she found the right angle. The nurses used to joke that she was trying to read invisible books." This revelation cast Dorothy's repositioning in an entirely different light. Rather than mysterious movement, it seemed like a continuation of lifelong habits. A woman so accustomed to reading that even in death, she'd arranged herself for the comfort and familiarity of her favorite activity. The reburial proceeded normally, but I made sure Dorothy's casket was positioned exactly as we'd found. Her tilted slightly, hands positioned for holding a book, everything arranged for maximum reading comfort. It seemed like the respectful thing to do for someone who'd spent her life surrounded by literature. Dorothy has remained in her preferred position since the reburial, and the weight distribution has stabilized exactly as you'd expect for a casket containing a small woman positioned slightly on her side. But sometimes, when I'm working in that section of the cemetery, I notice that the grass grows differently around her grave, thicker and greener, as if something beneficial is happening beneath the surface. The niece visits regularly now, bringing books to place on Dorothy's headstone. She always said that heaven would have the best library imaginable, she told me during one visit. I like to think she's already checked out her first book and settled in for some eternal reading. And sometimes, during quiet afternoons when the cemetery is peaceful and the light is just right, visitors report seeing a small elderly woman sitting beneath the oak tree near Dorothy's grave, reading contentedly with a stack of books beside her, as if the perfect reading spot exists both above and below ground, in the place where a librarian finally found her ideal position for enjoying literature throughout eternity. Sometimes the garden continues to grow even when the gardener isn't there to tend it. as if love itself has taken root in the soil. My name is Elena Rodriguez, and I've been maintaining the landscape at Willowbrook Memorial Gardens for 13 years. It's rewarding work, creating peaceful environments for families to remember their loved ones, ensuring that each section of the cemetery reflects the care and respect that the deceased deserve. But sometimes, nature surprises you in ways that challenge everything you understand about growing seasons, soil composition, and the basic laws of horticulture. Mrs. Rose Patterson was buried on a cold February morning when the ground was still frozen from winter's grip. She'd been a master gardener, someone whose backyard had been featured in local magazines for its stunning displays of roses, delphiniums, and perennials that bloomed in carefully orchestrated succession from spring through fall. Her funeral was filled with flowers from her own garden, carefully preserved since autumn, and arranged by friends who wanted to honor her with the varieties she'd loved most. "She could make anything grow," said her husband during the graveside service, his voice breaking as he spoke about the woman who'd turned their modest suburban lot into a neighborhood showcase. Even in the worst soil, even during drought years, Rose always found a way to coax beauty from the earth. The burial plot was in our newer section, where the soil is heavier clay that requires amendment and patience to support most plantings. I'd worked with many families to establish memorial gardens around grave sites, but the clay-based earth in that area was notoriously difficult for anything except the hardiest ground cover and established trees. Rose's exhumation came 7 months later, required by insurance investigators who needed to verify certain details about her death for a complex claim involving her extensive garden property. The legal requirements meant temporarily relocating her remains, while appraisers and investigators documented the value of her horticultural achievements. I was present during the exhumation to ensure that any landscaping around the gravesite was properly protected and restored. As the excavation crew carefully removed the soil above Rose's casket, I noticed something that made me stop and stare in amazement. Growing from the sealed casket itself, somehow emerging through microscopic gaps in the metal seams, were fresh rose stems with green leaves and developing buds. Not just 1 or 2 shoots, but dozens of healthy plants that had somehow taken root inside the casket and found their way to sunlight through impossible small openings. The roses weren't random varieties. They were specific cultivars that I recognized from the flowers at Rose's funeral. Mr. Lincoln with deep red blooms, Double Delight with cream and red edges, and Fragrant Cloud with orange-red petals that carried her signature sweet scent. These were Rose's favorite varieties, the ones she'd spent decades perfecting in her home garden. "How is this possible?" asked the lead investigator, examining the vigorous growth with obvious confusion. "Plants can't grow without soil, without proper drainage, without access to nutrients. This violates everything we know about basic botany." I had no answer that would satisfy a scientist or investigator, but as someone who'd spent years working with soil and plants, I knew I was witnessing something that transcended normal horticultural principles. The roses were thriving in conditions that should have made growth impossible, sealed in metal, buried in heavy clay, deprived of proper air circulation and water drainage. When they opened Rose's casket for the required identification, the source of the plant growth became even more mysterious and beautiful. The interior of the casket had somehow transformed into a miniature garden, with rose stems growing from what appeared to be rich, dark soil that had replaced the traditional silk lining. Rose herself looked peaceful and natural among the growing plants, as if she were simply resting in her own garden rather than buried in a cemetery. The roses weren't growing around her or over her, they were growing with her, integrated into the casket environment in a way that suggested harmony rather than intrusion. "The soil shouldn't be there," I told the investigators, trying to explain what I was seeing. "Caskets are sealed units designed to prevent soil infiltration. There's no way earth could have entered this space, let alone soil rich enough to support this kind of plant growth." But the evidence was undeniable. Somehow, Rose Patterson's burial site had become a functioning garden, complete with healthy soil, thriving plants, and growing conditions that supported varieties known for being challenging to cultivate even under ideal circumstances. The most remarkable aspect was the condition of the roses themselves. Despite growing in what should have been impossible circumstances, they showed no signs of stress, disease, or nutritional deficiency. The leaves were deep green and healthy, the stems strong and well-formed, the developing buds showing promise of spectacular blooms. I collected soil samples from inside the casket for testing, hoping to understand how such rich earth could have appeared in a sealed environment. The laboratory results showed soil composition that was absolutely perfect for rose cultivation. Optimal pH balance, ideal nutrient levels, perfect organic matter content. It was better soil than most master gardeners could create with years of careful amendment and cultivation. "This is impossible," said the soil scientist who analyzed my samples. "This is premium rose-growing medium, the kind of specialized soil that takes decades to develop. It couldn't have formed naturally in a buried casket, and it certainly couldn't have appeared overnight." Rose's husband, who had been called to provide identification, wasn't surprised by what we'd discovered. As he looked at his wife resting peacefully among her beloved roses, tears streamed down his face, but his expression was one of joy rather than grief. "She always said she wanted to be buried in her garden," he told us quietly. "We couldn't do that legally, so we settled for the cemetery." But Rose was never one to let legal technicalities stop her from growing things where she thought they should grow. The insurance investigators completed their work and prepared to authorize reburial. But Rose's husband asked if the roses could remain with her. The cemetery administration agreed, recognizing that the plants had somehow become part of Rose's final resting place in a way that honored both her memory and her remarkable talents. During the reburial ceremony, I helped transplant some of the casket roses to the area around Rose's headstone, creating a memorial garden that would allow her favorite varieties to continue growing in the traditional cemetery environment. But we left the strongest plants inside the casket with Rose, respecting her apparent desire to garden throughout eternity. The memorial garden thrived immediately, with the transplanted roses establishing themselves in our difficult clay soil as if it were the premium growing medium they'd originated from. Within months, Rose's gravesite became known throughout the cemetery for its spectacular floral displays that bloomed longer and more vibrantly than roses had any right to in our challenging conditions. Other families began requesting burial plots near Rose's garden, hoping that proximity to her horticultural gifts might benefit their own memorial plantings. And they weren't wrong. Plants established near Rose's grave showed unusual vigor, disease resistance, and extended blooming periods that defied normal expectations for cemetery landscaping. I visit Rose's garden regularly as part of my maintenance duties, but also because it's become one of the most peaceful and inspiring locations in the entire cemetery. The roses bloom in succession from early spring through late fall, providing continuous color and fragrance that attracts both visitors and beneficial insects. Sometimes, during quiet morning hours when I'm working alone in that section, I find fresh-cut roses placed on nearby graves where families haven't visited in weeks. Perfect blooms, with stems cut at the precise angle Rose used to teach in her gardening workshops. The flowers always match varieties from her memorial garden, arranged with the expert eye of someone who understood both horticulture and beauty. Rose Patterson created gardens throughout her life, but her final garden has become something more. A place where love literally takes root and grows, where the boundary between life and death becomes less important than the continuity of beauty, where a master gardener's touch continues to nurture growth in soil that shouldn't support it, but somehow produces the most magnificent roses anyone has ever seen. Modern technology can capture things that the human eye misses, but sometimes what it records raises more questions than it answers. My name is Kim Chen, and I've been Assistant Director at Maplewood Cemetery for 8 years. Part of my responsibilities include overseeing our security systems, the network of cameras and sensors that monitor the grounds 24 hours a day, protecting against vandalism and ensuring the safety of visitors and staff. Most of the footage we review is routine. Maintenance crews, mourning families, the occasional wildlife. But sometimes our cameras record things that challenge everything we think we know about the nature of death and consciousness. The infrared camera system was installed 3 years ago after a series of break-ins that had damaged several monuments and disturbed burial sites. The cameras detect heat signatures as well as visible movement, creating detailed records of any activity throughout the cemetery grounds. The system has been invaluable for security purposes, but it's also captured phenomena that have nothing to do with human intrusion. Mr. David Chen, no relation, despite the shared surname, was scheduled for exhumation on a Wednesday morning in November. Legal complications involving his estate required formal identification of remains before inheritance issues could be resolved. These administrative requirements are tedious, but necessary, and I always ensure that our security systems properly document every stage of the process. David had been buried for 6 months in Section D, a quiet area beneath mature maple trees that provides natural shade and peaceful ambiance for families visiting their loved ones. The exhumation was scheduled for 5 in the morning, before the cemetery opened to visitors, to maintain privacy and minimize disruption to other families. I arrived at 4:30 to review the security footage from the previous night. Standard procedure to ensure there had been no unauthorized activity near the gravesite before the exhumation crew began their work. Most nights show nothing more interesting than raccoons or the occasional deer crossing between headstones. But the infrared footage from David's grave revealed something that made me replay the recording multiple times, each viewing more unsettling than the last. At approximately 3:15 in the morning, the infrared camera detected a heat signature in David's burial plot, not above ground where a living visitor would appear, but emanating directly from the grave itself. The signature was human-shaped and appeared to be sitting upright, as if someone were resting comfortably on top of the soil. I enhanced the recording, adjusting the thermal sensitivity to get a clearer image of whatever was generating heat in a location where no living person should be present. The heat signature was distinct and stable, maintaining consistent temperature patterns that suggested a living human body rather than residual thermal energy from some other source. More unsettling was the timing of the heat signature's behavior. At 3:57, exactly 8 minutes before our exhumation crew arrived on site, the thermal image appeared to slowly lie down, the heat signature shifting from upright to horizontal, as if someone were carefully positioning themselves flat against the ground. By the time our crew began setting up equipment at 4:05, the infrared camera showed nothing unusual, just the normal thermal patterns of early morning cemetery grounds, with no sign of the heat signature that had been clearly visible for over 40 minutes. I shared the footage with our head groundskeeper, who confirmed that no living person could have been in that location during the recorded time frame. The cemetery was locked and secure, with no evidence of forced entry or unauthorized access. More importantly, the heat signature appeared to originate from below ground level, not from someone sitting on the surface of the grave. The exhumation proceeded normally until the crew opened David's casket for identification. Everything appeared standard. At first, David looked peaceful and dignified, positioned exactly as he'd been during burial 6 months earlier. But the court official overseeing the identification noticed something unusual about the temperature inside the casket. "That's strange," he murmured, checking his thermometer readings. "The internal temperature is significantly higher than it should be for a sealed casket that's been underground for 6 months. It's almost like there's been recent metabolic activity." I mentioned the infrared footage I'd reviewed that morning, describing the heat signature that had appeared to be sitting upright in David's grave just hours before the exhumation. The court official requested copies of the recording for his investigation file, though he admitted he had no scientific explanation for what the cameras had captured. Later that day, I researched David's background, hoping to find some context that might explain the unusual thermal activity at his gravesite. What I learned made the infrared recordings even more intriguing and poignant. David Chen had been a security guard for 32 years, working primarily night shifts at various locations throughout the city. His family described him as someone who took his responsibilities seriously, who prided himself on being alert and vigilant during the quiet hours when most people were sleeping. More significantly, David had worked the 3 to midnight shift at a downtown office building for the last 15 years of his career. Every night, he would conduct hourly rounds, checking doors and windows, monitoring security systems, ensuring that everything was safe and secure. His supervisor said David was the most reliable guard they'd ever employed. Always on time, always attentive, never missing a scheduled patrol. The pattern was unmistakable. The heat signature had appeared at 3:15 in the morning and remained active until just before our crew arrived. Exactly the kind of vigilant monitoring that David had practiced throughout his career. It was as if he were conducting one final security round, making sure his own grave site was properly protected before allowing the exhumation to proceed. I decided to review infrared footage from other nights to see if David's apparent security patrols were a regular occurrence. What I discovered was both fascinating and deeply moving. Every night for the past 6 months, the same heat signature had appeared at David's grave at exactly 3:15, maintaining its vigil until dawn. The recordings showed consistent patterns of what appeared to be careful surveillance behavior. The heat signature would move slightly around the grave area, as if someone were conducting a thorough security inspection, then settle into a stationary position that provided optimal observation of the surrounding cemetery grounds. Most remarkably, the thermal recordings captured what appeared to be David's response to actual security concerns. On the 3 occasions during the past 6 months when we'd had real intruders or vandalism attempts, the heat signature at David's grave had appeared earlier than usual and remained more active, as if he were providing enhanced security coverage during actual emergencies. I shared these findings with David's family, who weren't surprised by evidence that their father was continuing his security work even after death. His daughter Sarah smiled through tears as she reviewed the infrared footage. "Dad always said he'd never really retire from security work," she told me. "He loved protecting people, making sure everyone was safe. Even when he was sick near the end, he'd worry about who was going to take his shift, who was going to make sure the building stayed secure." Sarah requested copies of the infrared recordings, saying they provided comfort rather than fear. "It's like knowing Dad is still taking care of things, still making sure everyone is protected. That's exactly the kind of person he was, responsible to the end and beyond." After the reburial, I continued monitoring the infrared cameras around David's gravesite. The heat signature resumed its nightly appearances, maintaining the same 3:15 schedule that had characterized David's final years of security work. But now the pattern included what appeared to be enhanced coverage during cemetery visiting hours, as if David had expanded his protective duties to include the families who came to visit their loved ones. The most touching discovery came 2 months later, when I noticed that David's heat signature seemed to coordinate with other unusual thermal activity throughout the cemetery. On nights when other graves showed unexplained heat signatures, phenomena I'd previously dismissed as equipment malfunctions, David's thermal pattern would shift position as if he were investigating or responding to these occurrences. I realized that David Chen had apparently organized a network of security coverage that extended throughout Maplewood Cemetery. The random heat signatures that our cameras had been detecting for years weren't equipment malfunctions. They were evidence of former security guards, police officers, military personnel, and other protective individuals who'd continued their vigilant duties even after death. The infrared system had been inadvertently documenting an entire community of the deceased who'd taken it upon themselves to protect the cemetery and its visitors. David, with his decades of security experience, had apparently become their coordinator, organizing patrols and ensuring comprehensive coverage of the grounds. I presented this theory to the cemetery board, showing them months of thermal recordings that demonstrated organized, intelligent surveillance patterns that couldn't be explained by equipment malfunction or natural phenomena. Rather than being disturbed by the evidence, they voted to upgrade our infrared system to provide better documentation of what they termed supernatural security services. The enhanced cameras now capture detailed recordings of nightly patrol activities throughout Maplewood Cemetery. David's heat signature remains the most consistent and active, appearing every night at 3:15 and maintaining vigilant coverage until dawn. But he's clearly not working alone. Thermal recordings show coordinated activities that suggest a well-organized security force operating in the space between life and death. Families of former military and law enforcement personnel buried at Maplewood have begun requesting copies of infrared footage, showing their loved ones continuing their protective duties. Rather than finding the recordings frightening, most families express gratitude for evidence that their protectors are still on duty, still watching over others with the same dedication they showed during life. The cemetery has become known as one of the safest memorial parks in the region, with virtually no vandalism or security incidents since David began his posthumous patrols. Families often comment on the sense of protection and security they feel while visiting, as if invisible guardians are ensuring their safety and peace of mind. And sometimes, during quiet morning hours when I'm reviewing the previous night's infrared recordings, I notice thermal signatures that appear to wave or nod in acknowledgement of the cameras, as if David and his team know they're being watched and appreciate having their dedication documented and recognized. David Chen never missed a shift during 32 years of security work, and apparently death wasn't going to change that record. The infrared cameras continue to capture evidence of his nightly patrols, proving that some people take their responsibilities so seriously that not even the grave can relieve them of duty. In David's case, eternal rest apparently includes eternal vigilance, and Maplewood Cemetery is more secure because of his refusal to abandon his post. Personal effects tell stories about the lives people lived, but sometimes they tell stories about futures that hadn't happened yet. My name is Tom Bradley, and I've been managing records and personal effects at Riverside Memorial Services for 16 years. It's detailed work that requires absolute accuracy, cataloging belongings, maintaining chain of custody, ensuring that families receive exactly what was entrusted to us during their darkest hours. Every item tells a story, and every story deserves to be preserved with dignity and care. But sometimes the stories change in ways that challenge everything I think I know about time, memory, and the finality of death. William Peterson was buried with Box 23, a small collection of personal effects that his daughter had specifically requested remain with him. His father's pocket watch, his wedding ring, his reading glasses, and a wallet containing photographs of his family. Standard procedure for meaningful items that families want to accompany their loved ones into eternity. William had died suddenly of a heart attack at age 76, leaving behind his wife Martha and 3 grown children who remembered him as a devoted family man with an obsessive attention to detail. His daughter explained that he'd kept meticulous records of everything, every family photo dated and labeled, every important document filed and organized, every significant moment of his life carefully documented. Dad was incredibly organized, she told me while selecting items for burial. He kept detailed records of everything that mattered to him. These are the things he'd want to have with him: his father's watch that he wound every morning, his wedding ring from 1972, and his wallet with pictures of all of us. I personally cataloged each item in Box 23, photographing everything for our records and documenting serial numbers, engravings, and other identifying details. The pocket watch was a beautiful 1940s Hamilton, with William's father's initials engraved on the case. The wedding ring was simple gold, with an inscription reading, "Forever Martha, 1972. The wallet contained 7 photographs spanning 40 years of family memories. The exhumation order came 11 months later. Estate complications involving inheritance disputes required formal identification and verification of burial contents before legal proceedings could continue. These situations always involve extensive documentation, and I prepared comprehensive records of everything that had been buried with William. When they opened William's casket for identification, everything appeared normal at first. He looked peaceful and dignified, exactly as he had during the viewing nearly a year earlier. But when the court official examined Box 23, he immediately noticed discrepancies between my documented inventory and the actual contents. The pocket watch was different, still a Hamilton, but from the 1960s instead of the 40s, with different initials engraved on the case. The wedding ring remained the same, but the wallet contained photographs that I'd never seen before, images that clearly showed William's family, but appeared to have been taken after his death. These photographs weren't in the original inventory, I told the court official, comparing the current contents to my detailed records. I documented 7 specific photos spanning 1972 to 2015. But there are 10 photos now, and 3 of them show events that occurred after William's burial. The most unsettling photograph showed William's granddaughter's wedding, which had taken place 6 months after his death. The image was professionally taken, showing the bride in her wedding dress standing next to an empty chair decorated with flowers, clearly a memorial place setting for William. But somehow, a copy of this photograph had found its way into his buried wallet. Another photo showed the birth of his newest great-grandchild, born 8 months after William's death. The hospital photograph showed his son holding the baby, with a small framed picture of William positioned prominently in the scene. Again, this was an event that had occurred long after William's burial, yet somehow he'd acquired photographic documentation of it. The court official documented the discrepancies carefully, photographing both my original inventory and the current contents of Box 23. But the mystery deepened when I examined the pocket watch more closely and realized why it looked different from my records. The watch wasn't different. It had been updated. The original 1940s Hamilton was still there, but it had somehow been serviced and restored to perfect working condition. The crystal was clear and unblemished. The hands showed no signs of age or corrosion, and the mechanism was running with the precision of a newly manufactured timepiece. More significantly, the watch was keeping perfect time, synchronized exactly with the current date and hour, despite having been buried for 11 months, with no possibility of winding or maintenance. The inscription on the case had been refreshed, with the original initials now accompanied by additional engraving that read, "From William to William," and the date of his grandson's high school graduation, an event that had occurred 2 months earlier. William's daughter was called to verify the identification and examine the altered personal effects. When she saw the new photographs and the restored watch, her reaction was immediate recognition rather than confusion. "Those are from Tommy's wedding and Sarah's baby," she said, examining the photographs with tears in her eyes. "We made sure Dad was represented at both events. We set up memorial displays with his picture, told stories about him, made sure everyone knew he was there in spirit." She looked at the restored pocket watch with amazement and something that might have been gratitude. "And this watch? Dad always said he wanted to give it to William Jr. when he graduated, but he died before that could happen. We ended up giving Billy Dad's backup watch instead. But this one, his father's original Hamilton, this was supposed to go to Billy." The implications were both impossible and deeply moving. Somehow, William Peterson had continued to participate in family events after his death, acquiring photographs and maintaining connections with developments in his children's and grandchildren's lives. The updated watch suggested that he was not only aware of current events, but actively preparing gifts for future occasions. When we prepared to close the casket for reburial, William's daughter asked if she could add one more item to Box 23, a recent family portrait taken at Tommy's wedding that included memorial elements honoring William's presence. As she placed the photograph in the box, she spoke quietly to her father. "I know you're still watching over us, Dad. Thank you for staying connected, for still being part of our family even though you can't be here physically. We love you, and we'll keep including you in everything important." The reburial proceeded without incident, but I've continued monitoring the situation through periodic checks with William's family. According to his daughter, they've started including memorial elements for William at every significant family gathering, believing that he somehow receives documentation of these events and adds them to his eternal collection. 6 months after the reburial, William's grandson Billy graduated from college, the grandson who had inherited the backup pocket watch instead of his grandfather's original Hamilton. At the graduation ceremony, Billy noticed that his inherited watch had stopped working despite having been recently serviced. Later that evening, Billy visited his grandfather's grave and found a small package wrapped in tissue paper beneath the headstone flowers. Inside was a perfectly restored 1940s Hamilton pocket watch with his great-grandfather's initials and a new inscription, "To Billy with love and pride. Graduation 2024. From your Grandpa William." The family now considers William's gravesite a communication point, where he continues to express his love and involvement in their lives. They bring photographs from important events, leave notes about family developments, and occasionally find small tokens or updated personal effects that suggest William is maintaining his own records of their continuing story. I've learned that some people are so devoted to their families that death doesn't end their participation. It just changes the methods they use to stay connected. William Peterson spent his life documenting family memories, and apparently he's continuing that work from beyond the grave, ensuring that love and connection transcend the physical boundaries that separate the living from the dead. Box 23 has become more than a collection of personal effects. It's an ongoing correspondence between a devoted father and the family he refused to leave behind. Proof that some bonds are strong enough to bridge any distance, even the ultimate distance between life and death. Some people take their responsibilities so seriously that they'll show up for work even when they're no longer technically employed by the living. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and I've been coordinating transport and logistics for Valley View Cemetery for 12 years. Part of my job involves scheduling and overseeing every burial, ensuring that families, clergy, and funeral home staff all arrive at the correct time and location. It's detail-oriented work that requires precise coordination, especially when multiple services are scheduled on the same day. But one particular witness appears at every burial in Section K, regardless of whether he's been invited or even acknowledged by the families involved. I first noticed him during my second year at Valley View. Every funeral in Section K, the older section beneath the oak trees near the original cemetery entrance, included the same elderly gentleman standing at a respectful distance from the main gathering. He wore a simple brown coat that looked like it belonged to the 1960s, carried a worn fedora in his hands, and maintained the solemn dignity appropriate for funeral services. At first, I assumed he was a distant relative or family friend who preferred to pay his respects quietly, rather than joining the main group of mourners. His behavior was impeccable. He would arrive before the funeral procession, position himself where he could observe the service without intruding, and nod once respectfully before walking away as the family began to leave. But after seeing him at dozens of funerals over several months, I realized that his presence wasn't connected to any particular family or deceased individual. He attended every burial in Section K, regardless of the person being interred, the size of the gathering, or the religious traditions being observed. He was equally respectful at services for elderly grandmothers and tragic young accident victims, for large family gatherings and sparse ceremonies with only a few mourners. I began paying closer attention to his routine, trying to understand his connection to Section K or his reason for attending so many unrelated services. He always arrived exactly 15 minutes before the scheduled burial time, positioned himself at the same location near the stone wall that bordered Section K, and maintained his quiet vigil until the casket was lowered and the family began to disperse. His age appeared consistent over the years. I observed him neither growing older nor showing signs of declining health that might be expected in an elderly man attending outdoor services in all weather conditions. He seemed frozen at approximately 75 years old, with silver hair, gentle features, and a manner that suggested deep familiarity with grief and loss. I decided to approach him after a particularly moving service for a young mother who died unexpectedly, leaving behind 3 small children. He'd maintained his usual respectful distance during the ceremony, but his expression had seemed especially sorrowful as he watched the children say goodbye to their mother. "Excuse me," I said as he prepared to leave. "I'm Sarah Mitchell, the transport coordinator here. I've seen you at many services in Section K, and I wanted to make sure you're finding everything you need for your visits." He turned to face me with a gentle smile that seemed both sad and grateful. "Thank you for your kindness, Miss Mitchell. I'm just here to witness, to make sure everyone receives the respect they deserve during their final ceremony. It's important work, seeing people safely to their rest." His voice carried an accent that seemed to belong to an earlier generation, formal and courteous in a way that suggested upbringing from decades past. But what struck me most was his use of the phrase, "final ceremony," terminology that funeral industry professionals use, but that's uncommon among the general public. "Are you connected to the funeral industry?" I asked, curious about his professional manner and obvious familiarity with burial protocols. "I worked for the cemetery for many years," he replied, adjusting his fedora carefully. "Started here in 1958, right out of high school. Loved the work. Loved helping families during difficult times. Some jobs are too important to retire from, you know." This information provided context for his dedicated attendance, but it also raised new questions. If he'd worked at Valley View for many years, other staff members should recognize him or remember his employment. I made a mental note to ask longtime employees about his history with the cemetery. "What was your position here?" I asked, hoping to learn more about his background and tenure. "Transport coordination, mostly. Making sure everyone got where they needed to be, when they needed to be there. Logistics, scheduling, family liaison work. Same as what you do now, I imagine. Though we did things a bit differently in those days." He spoke with obvious affection for the work and deep understanding of its importance. But as I tried to continue the conversation, he politely excused himself, saying he needed to prepare for the next scheduled service. I watched as he walked away toward the cemetery office, but when I checked a few minutes later, no one had seen him enter the building. I researched Valley View's employment records, looking for information about longtime transport coordinators who might match the elderly gentleman's description. What I found in the personnel archives made me question everything I thought I understood about his regular appearances at Section K funerals. Arthur Henley had worked as transport coordinator at Valley View Cemetery from 1958 to 1996, 38 years of dedicated service, helping families navigate the logistics of laying their loved ones to rest. He'd been known for his attention to detail, his compassionate manner with grieving families, and his belief that every person deserved a dignified burial regardless of their circumstances. Arthur's employment record showed exemplary service, with commendations from families and colleagues who praised his professionalism and kindness during their most difficult moments. He'd never missed a scheduled burial, never failed to ensure that every detail was properly coordinated, never allowed logistical problems to add stress to families who were already suffering. But according to the records, Arthur Henley had died in 1997, just 1 year after his retirement. He was buried in Section K, plot number 87, beneath one of the oak trees where he'd overseen thousands of burials during his long career. I visited Arthur's gravesite and found exactly what I expected: a simple headstone bearing his name, dates of birth and death, and an inscription that read, "Faithful servant, devoted friend." The dates confirmed that Arthur Henley had been dead for over 25 years, making his ongoing attendance at Section K funerals impossible unless you believed in explanations that transcended normal understanding of life and death. But the evidence of my own observations was undeniable. I'd spoken with Arthur multiple times, watched him attend dozens of funerals, seen him interact respectfully with families and cemetery staff. Either I was experiencing elaborate hallucinations, or Arthur Henley had found a way to continue his professional duties even after death. I decided to test this theory by observing Arthur's behavior more systematically. Over the following months, I documented his appearance at every Section K burial, noting his arrival time, positioning, and departure routine. The pattern was absolutely consistent. He attended every single service in his former area of responsibility, maintaining the same professional standards he'd upheld during his 38 years of living employment. More remarkably, I realized that Arthur seemed to coordinate with current cemetery staff in subtle but meaningful ways. When families arrived early or funeral processions were delayed, Arthur would adjust his timing accordingly, as if he were somehow monitoring our scheduling systems and adapting his attendance to support our current operations. During one particularly difficult burial, a child's service with family tensions that threatened to disrupt the ceremony, Arthur positioned himself more prominently than usual, his presence somehow calming the situation and helping maintain the dignity that every burial deserves. Afterward, the funeral director commented on how peaceful the service had been, despite the family conflicts, as if an invisible hand had guided everyone toward appropriate behavior. I shared my research and observations with Valley View's current director, who listened with interest rather than skepticism. Arthur Henley was legendary among our staff, he told me. Even people who never worked with him directly heard stories about his dedication and professionalism. If anyone would find a way to continue serving families after death, it would be Arthur. The director decided that Arthur's ongoing presence was beneficial rather than problematic, representing continuity and dedication that enhanced Valley View's reputation for compassionate service. Rather than trying to discourage his appearances, we began acknowledging him as an unofficial emeritus member of our staff. I still coordinate all burials in Section K, but now I include Arthur in my mental checklist of service requirements. I arrive 15 minutes early to ensure he has time to position himself appropriately, and I always scan the gathering to confirm his respectful presence among the mourners. Families often comment on the sense of peace and dignity they feel during services at Valley View, not knowing that their loved ones are being honored by someone who's dedicated eternity to ensuring that every burial receives the respect and attention it deserves. Arthur Henley worked at Valley View Cemetery for 38 years, and apparently retirement and death were just temporary interruptions in a career devoted to serving grieving families. His brown coat and fedora have become permanent fixtures at Section K burials, proof that some people take their professional responsibilities so seriously that not even the grave can relieve them of duty. The final comfort we provide is positioning that allows peaceful rest. But sometimes the deceased know better than we do about what constitutes true comfort. My name is James Morrison, and I've been directing funerals and preparing the deceased for viewing for 28 years. Every detail matters in this work. The clothes we select, the cosmetics we apply, the positioning that creates an appearance of peaceful sleep rather than death. Families need to see their loved ones looking comfortable and dignified, as if they're simply resting before a long journey. But sometimes our professional positioning isn't what the deceased prefer for their eternal rest. Mrs. Catherine Walsh came to us in December after a brief illness that had weakened her body but left her spirit intact until the very end. At 87, she'd lived independently, maintained her own home, and insisted on doing things her own way, right up until her final hospitalization. Her daughter Margaret described her as fiercely independent, particular about her routines, and someone who'd never been comfortable sleeping on her back. Mom always slept on her side, Margaret explained, as we discussed preparation preferences. Ever since I was little, I remember her curled up on her left side, with her arm tucked under her pillow. She used to say that sleeping on your back was unnatural, that people were meant to sleep in comfortable positions that felt like home. Despite this information, professional standards required that we position Catherine on her back for the viewing. Funeral presentation follows established protocols that create dignified appearances appropriate for public services. We position the hands folded across the chest, the head slightly elevated on a pillow, the entire body arranged in a formal manner that conveys respect and peaceful rest. Catherine looked beautiful during the viewing, elegant in the navy blue dress Margaret had chosen, her gray hair carefully styled, her hands folded with the dignity appropriate for a woman who'd lived nearly 9 decades with grace and determination. The service was lovely, filled with stories about her independence and strength, attended by 3 generations of family who would miss her terribly. The burial proceeded normally, with Catherine laid to rest in Hillside Cemetery beside her husband of 62 years. I personally ensured that her casket was positioned correctly and that every detail met our highest standards for respectful interment. After 28 years in the funeral industry, I take pride in providing families with services that honor their loved ones' memories. The exhumation order came 8 months later. Insurance investigations related to Catherine's estate required formal identification and documentation before claims could be processed. These bureaucratic requirements are unfortunate interruptions of eternal rest, but they're sometimes necessary for legal and financial resolution. I accompanied the exhumation crew to oversee the process and ensure that Catherine's remains were handled with the same respect and dignity we'd provided during her original burial. When they opened her casket for identification, I expected to see exactly what we'd left there 8 months earlier. Catherine positioned formally on her back, hands folded, head elevated on her pillow. Instead, I found Catherine positioned exactly as Margaret had described her mother's lifelong sleeping preference. She was lying comfortably on her left side, her arm tucked under the casket pillow, her entire posture suggesting someone who'd adjusted her position for maximum comfort. Not randomly shifted or disturbed, but deliberately arranged as if she'd carefully rearranged herself for better sleep. "That's interesting," murmured the court official overseeing the identification. "Was she buried in this position?" "No," I replied, checking my preparation notes to confirm what I already knew. Mrs. Walsh was positioned according to standard protocol on her back, arms folded across the chest, head elevated. This is a completely different arrangement, but the evidence was unmistakable. Catherine had somehow repositioned herself from formal burial posture to natural sleeping position, creating the kind of comfortable arrangement that had characterized her rest throughout 87 years of life. She looked peaceful and content, as if she'd finally found the position that allowed true relaxation. Margaret was called to provide identification and witness the unusual circumstances of her mother's positioning. When she saw Catherine arranged on her side with her arm under the pillow, her reaction was immediate recognition and deep emotional relief. "That's exactly how she always slept," Margaret said through tears that seemed to mix grief with joy. "Every night for as long as I can remember, that's exactly how I'd find her, in the morning curled up on her left side, arm tucked under her pillow, looking completely comfortable and peaceful." She knelt beside the casket, reaching out to touch her mother's hand with obvious love and gratitude. "Oh, Mom, you found your comfortable position, didn't you? You never could sleep well on your back. And now you've arranged yourself just the way you like it." The court official completed his identification and prepared to close the casket, but Margaret asked if we could leave Catherine in her preferred position for reburial. She felt strongly that her mother had somehow communicated her needs and preferences, and that we should respect her apparent desire for comfort over formal protocol. I agreed immediately. After 28 years of positioning the deceased according to professional standards, I'd learned something important about the difference between formal dignity and personal comfort. Catherine had shown us that sometimes the most respectful thing we can do is allow people to rest in positions that feel natural and comfortable rather than formally appropriate. During the reburial ceremony, I spoke briefly about Catherine's apparent preference for sleeping comfort over formal positioning, and how her family had chosen to honor her needs rather than conventional protocols. Several other families approached me afterward, asking if their loved ones could be positioned according to personal sleeping preferences rather than industry standards. This experience changed my approach to funeral preparation. I now ask families about their loved ones' sleeping habits and comfort preferences, offering positioning that reflects personal needs rather than simply following professional conventions. Many families express relief that their loved ones can rest in positions that feel familiar and comfortable. Catherine Walsh has remained in her preferred sleeping position since the reburial, and Margaret visits regularly, bringing fresh flowers and speaking quietly to her mother about family developments. "I always know exactly how to picture her now," Margaret told me during a recent visit, "comfortable and peaceful, sleeping the way she did for 87 years. Other families have started requesting similar accommodations, asking for positioning that reflects their loved one's personal comfort preferences rather than formal funeral industry standards. We've learned that dignity and respect can be expressed through individual comfort as effectively as through conventional protocol. And sometimes, during quiet moments when I'm preparing someone for their final rest, I remember Catherine Walsh and her lesson about the importance of personal comfort over professional convention. Some people know exactly how they need to sleep, and the kindest thing we can do is help them find that position and maintain it throughout eternity. The funeral industry talks about providing eternal rest, but Catherine taught me that true rest requires comfort, and comfort is deeply personal. Now, when families ask about positioning options, I tell them about the woman who rearranged herself for better sleep, proving that even in death, some people know exactly what they need to be truly comfortable and peaceful.